Franz Liszt, the wildly popular 19th century composer for whom a whole new term had to be invented to describe the fanaticism of his fans, navigates life as an artist trying to survive and have quite a lot of sex while being pursued by his sometimes friend and frequent nemesis, proto-Nazi vampire Richard Wagner. Thor Odin's son, the popular superhero, discovers he has a long-lost sister just before she takes over his home of Asgard and reveals its true history of colonialism and oppression. These are the protagonists of Ken Russell's 1975 musical biopic Lisztomania and Taika Waititi's 2017 sci-fi action-adventure Thor Ragnarok. What could these two films possibly have in common? That's what we're talking about in this episode of The Celluloid Mirror.
I mean, what do you think? You think they stand a chance? Well, you're on their side, aren't you? Who are you betting on,
Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?
Look at these lies.
One shall stand, one shall fall.
Even if one of them survives,
the only way to stop him is to make another movie.
Welcome to The Celluloid Mirror. I am one of your hosts, Nicole Solomon.
And I am the other one of your hosts, Sean Mannion. On The Celluloid Mirror, we take two films and look at what they reflect about each other, the audience, and our culture at large. Today, we're talking about Ken Russell's 1975 surreal musical biopic, Lisztomania, and Taika Waititi's 2017 superhero space sequel, Thor Ragnarok.
We will start by giving a brief synopsis of each film, discuss our responses to the films, as well as critical responses to them, and then we will dive in on what the films say about one another.
Yay!
So, yay. We've been planning this episode for a long time.
This
listeners.
is actually one of the first episodes we even talked about doing.
Yeah, when we were first talking about doing this show at all, this was a possibility that came up pretty early on.
I think you hadn't even seen Lisztomania at the point I mentioned it. I don't think.
I don't think I had, because I did see. Well, we'll talk about it more later when I saw Lisztomania for the first time. But yeah, it's been a journey, and if we're going to take our listeners on the journey, it might help to tell them what these films are about, don't you think?
I think that would be good. I can take Lisztomania if you want to do Thor Ragnarok.
I would love to do Thor Ragnarok. And everybody, sorry. Oh boy. I will give a synopsis of Thor Ragnarok, and you can give a spoilerific synopsis of Lisztomania. Listeners, if you have not seen Lisztomania or Thor Ragnarok, we're going to give away many plot points.
Oh god.
I mean, I don't know that Lisztomania is a movie that can be spoiled.
No, I think even if I tell you, and it's going to be hard to tell you exactly what happens. The experience is a unique experience on its own. I will say that it is currently on HBO Max as of the recording of this episode. And it had not been available on streaming except for to like buy on iTunes, I think, or maybe buy on Amazon, but it had never been like available streaming until like right before we decided to do this episode, or finally decided to do this episode.
So we're clearly tapped into something.
It's something. I think it's actually playing at, if you're in New York and Brooklyn, I think it's actually playing at the Alamo in Brooklyn in the next month or so. It may be after this episode comes. It may be before this episode comes out. It may not be available anymore, but it's getting around. So what happens in Lisztomania?
Yeah, in Lisztomania.
To be honest, is penises mostly. It's mostly penises. And I'm not really joking about that.
There are some vaginas as well.
There are, but it's a lot of penises. So if, you know what, honestly, you know what, that is something that I would say might be a warning for people. If you're like, you know what, I don't need to see a lot of penises, you might want to avoid this movie because it's everywhere.
I mean, although if you just don't want to see realistic penises, there aren't a lot of those.
There are definitely not a lot of those. It is very representational. When I say this, I'm not saying that there's like a lot of guys going around with penises out. I'm saying that there's a lot of columns, which are already very, what's the word I'm looking for? Phallic. That are
a lot of columns?
Columns, like columns that hold up the ceilings in buildings. Oh, did you not notice all the columns that are penises?
No, you know what? That's an excellent point. But there are also non-column penises.
Yes.
That are not realistic. Just
that are not realistic also.
I was thinking of a different penis in particular that happens.
You were thinking of the 8-foot penis.
Is it only 8 feet?
I think technically it is only 8 feet. I remember reading it because I think he's sitting on something else. Anyway, I should actually
in my mind. Anyway, yes.
I should actually describe this because people are going to be like, what is this 8-foot penis? It's not a porn. It is not a porn. Although knowing the youth these days, they're going to say it is, which just maybe sounds super old, but you know what? I'm not wrong. So Lisztomania, it follows the career of the pianist Franz Liszt. I know I said pianist. He's a pianist and there's a lot of penises. God, I don't know how I think we're going to get pulled for how many times I've said penis.
We are very mature, so I'm sure we're going to be able to just put this in its artistic context and not make juvenile jokes.
Probably
at all,
not.
Because look how great a job we're doing so far.
So he's pianist Franz Liszt. If you're not familiar with him, he was actually, and I'm not super familiar with him, honestly, beyond the movie. I've read a little bit about him. He was wildly popular in the 19th century. Like the film's name Lisztomania is actually based on the fact that they invented a term to describe the fervor for him when he would perform. He was like the original rock star, essentially. And that's how they treat him. And that's why he's played by Roger Daltry. Also, because Ken Russell, the director, already had a relationship with Roger Daltry and The Who because they just made Tommy. They actually came out the same year. Lisztomania and Tommy came out the same year. And if you thought Tommy was weird, if you've seen Tommy and you're like, Tommy's kind of weird, I don't know about Tommy, let me tell you, you have not seen weird until you've seen Lisztomania. Anyway, it follows him. And one of the things to understand about the film fundamentally is that everything in the film is just metaphor, like visual metaphors. Everything is extremely heightened. Everything is intended to be a step removed from reality. It is a very, even though it's a biopic, it doesn't care about the literal events. It cares about the meaning of events. It cares about the meaning of relationships. And so all the sets are very stylized. All the character designs are very stylized. There is many characters and many side people are very caricaturized, and sometimes in problematic ways. We'll talk about that. So it follows his part of his career toward and through to the end of his life. And it starts with showing how he ends up with the woman who is the mother of several of his children, and she was an upper class woman, and he was essentially a servant who was teaching her how to be how to play piano, and they slept together, and then she ran off with him. And that's the movie starts by showing that. Then the movie moves forward many years and shows him in performance halls and his popularity, and introduces the antagonist of the film, who is the composer Richard Wagner, who is portrayed in a very boyish, and he's a very clinger, hanger-on type in the beginning, right before a performance by Liszt, where Liszt said, "Oh, I read some of your music. I'm going to play some of your music." Wagner, which ultimately kind of leads to a point of friction that is going to come between them. It's not exactly a rivalry, but when Liszt decides to play some of Wagner's work, everybody kind of doesn't want to listen to it, or nobody's really interested in that. And so he ends up going back to some of his standards, one of them being chopsticks. Something that Liszt did is he did a lot of variations on some things like chopsticks. So And this is something that upsets Wagner. He doesn't like being teased and will ultimately kind of come back. Then we follow Liszt through basically the upper classes because of his popularity. Princesses and czars and everybody all want him to be their sort of court pianist and to, you know, be popular in that way. And this leads him to Russia. And the princess, who, this is where there's so many of the penises. Her entire room is, the columns are all penises. And then there is a sequence in which Liszt has and is riding an 8-foot, perhaps 10 or 12 feet. I'm not sure.
I'm voting 12. Let us know. Let us know how long you think.
I thought I'd read something online at one point about the prop that it was an 8-foot tall.
Yes, and the entire reason I'm saying 12 feet is because I read somewhere on the internet something about 12-foot penis.
Okay, and I might just be missing the 8-foot thing. So
this was, I don't even remember where on the internet I read that.
It's not really realistic looking. It's semi, you know, it's
more realistic than I remembered.
Yeah, it's
the veins
semi.
and stuff.
It's got a big, it's a big veiny penis that he rides, and it's a music. The film is a musical, so there's this big musical sequence, and it's essentially a sequence about him selling his artistic soul, which ultimately leads to this princess who is somewhat depicted as the devil. She gets very kind of scary, and it's got kind of a spider theme, web thing going to it. There's a lot of levels of stuff going on here.
She's got those cool, like the wingy thing.
Exactly.
I really like that. I liked that.
If it's not clear, there's no way that I can do justice to synopsisizing this movie, guys. So I'm trying to give you the broad strokes. But then there's a guillotine, which is for his penis, which is, you know, is represented somewhat. That is a representation of his talent and his art, is the penis, which I think has a lot to do with just, he was very sexual. He got around a lot. So Russell is making some connections there between those. So that's part of it. He ends up, right before that, it introduces his children with the woman from the beginning of the film, including one who ends up being very important to the rest of the film, one who we will talk about more throughout the episode, who is Cosima, his daughter Cosima, who is somewhat resentful of her father's career. She ends up marrying a friend of his, which we see a little bit of. Liszt encounters Wagner again later, and Wagner is, one of the things with Wagner from the very beginning is he's always talking about how music is being sort of a vehicle for his revolution of the people, which he's obsessed with. And then when he returns, this is part of it again. As we mentioned in the cold open, he is a vampire at one point. When Liszt meets him again, he's actually like a literal vampire and drains some of the blood from Liszt. We'll talk about what that is about a little bit more later. He ends up being rejected by Liszt, and when and Liszt is separate from the troubles that are going on and fighting that's happening. But Wagner then encounters his daughter. He encounters Cosima with her husband and child, and they have a connection, which becomes important later. Liszt ends up joining the church. And there we meet, the church being the Catholic Church, there we meet the Pope, who is played by Ringo Starr. The Pope ultimately tells Liszt that he has been tainted because of his association with Wagner, because Wagner is now married to his daughter, and that Wagner is essentially, he's the Antichrist, is what this Ringo Starr, the Pope, says. And he says that Liszt has to go and stop him. And then the weird movie starts to get even weirder, because it basically turns into a Hammer horror film where Liszt goes to this small village and everybody goes scattering when he mentions Wagner, and Wagner is dressed very flamboyantly in a castle, and he has built and we see some imagery some Nazi propaganda type imagery, Nazis, proto-Nazis there. There's a whole sort of group of children being led by Cosima, and they're all wearing sort of Superman-like outfits with big fancy W's on them for Wagner. And Liszt sees what Wagner's been working on, and Wagner has been working on his Superman, essentially. I don't think they actually call it like the Ubermensch in it, but that's what it's in reference to. And it is a stupid robot Thor. And the stupid robot Thor ends up dying. Wagner ends up dying, but not for long, because he is soon resurrected by Cosima as a sort of Frankenstein Hitler with a electric guitar machine gun. By this point, Liszt has died, but Wagner is out in the streets killing everybody, particularly caricatures of Jewish people.
That's all he's only killing
I think it's
Jews,
only
right?
that. Yeah.
He just goes to the Jewish area of town
and starts mowing them down with his machine gun, his electric guitar machine gun, followed by his Wagner super children. And from heaven, or at least the sky, Liszt and all the women he loved, including a version of Cosima, look down on it and say, well, we've got to do something about that. And so they're all playing music and singing a song, and it's very hippie-ish. And so they all climb into a rocket ship powered by love, essentially. They all climb into a love rocket ship in heaven and then fly the love rocket ship down to fight. I am not making this up. I am not exaggerating. I am trying to keep this as simple as possible.
You're doing great.
I'm missing a lot of stuff. I'm missing a lot of stuff.
You're almost there.
And so they fly the love rocket ship, or the love-powered rocket ship, excuse me, and they fire rainbow lasers at Franken-Hitler and his electric guitar machine gun. And they destroy Franken-Hitler and his electric guitar machine gun. And then Liszt sings a song basically about love winning, love triumphing. And that's the movie. And I left out a lot of stuff. I might have even gotten some stuff in the wrong order, but it's an experience, not a plot.
Yeah, my understanding is that reportedly this script was 57 pages long.
Which is, obviously all
Plenty.
You need to make perfection. So
there's a lot, listeners, when you watch this movie, because you should watch this movie, there's a lot where you can see how, like, this 10-minute long scene was probably 3 sentences.
Yeah. I mean, it's a musical.
Guy rides a giant business around, and they all, like, climb on it, and then the guillotine. That's all you really need to say. That scene goes on a while, as it should.
Yes.
As it should.
I mean, it's a musical. You got to have, like, longer musical numbers. Oh, I forgot right before that, it is Oliver Reed. So Ken Russell, he did the Devils, and Oliver Reed has a little role as I believe as a cop.
Yeah.
Right before Liszt gets knocked out with some gas. As I recall, the holes where the gas that knocks him out comes from, those are the vaginas, if I recall right.
No, the gas was mostly coming out of butts.
Oh, you're right. The gas was butts. The gas was butts because that's the joke.
But like Carolyn at some point is in like a giant vagina, or like a giant. Maybe she's partially in a vagina. She's mostly in some labia.
Yes.
And Liszt pursues her into a giant. There's a scene where Liszt is going through what's obviously a very large vagina.
Yes.
Like tunnel. Yeah.
Yes. So what we're saying, audience, is this is an amazing film. This is incredible.
There is nothing like it.
You have not seen film until you have seen Lisztomania.
It's a very interesting companion piece to The Devils.
Yeah.
In terms of like takes on the Catholic Church, it was super, because I rewatched The Devils within the past couple months, so I do recommend looking at those two films together as well, but it's a lot more batshit than the Devils.
Oh yeah. I mean, Ken Russell's whole like 70s output, we can talk more about this later, but his whole 70s output and all because he did like basically a series of biopics about composers. And then he also did the Devils, and he also did in the 70s, he did Tommy. Basically, it was either about art or religion or art and religion in all of them. And there's a through line through all of it, which honestly, I think he probably doesn't get enough credit for the unified sort of thing that he was exploring throughout that era, especially because a lot of the films are harder to access because they are not, they should be talked about alongside a lot of the films that we talk about, the other films that we talk about from the 70s, the Scorsese films and the Spielberg films and all that. Like,
absolutely.
As they're really impressive works. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, relatedly, the Devils, as of our recording at least, is still on Shudder, and if you haven't seen that, and unless you're unless you're someone who's like, I really don't need to see that movie, that's fine. I understand that it's an upsetting movie, but that is a very hard to find movie, and Shudder periodically puts it up there. And so while it's up there, highly, highly recommend. I am eternally mad at the unavailability of that movie. It makes me very angry.
It's bullshit.
It's bullshit. And you know what might not be bullshit is my synopsis of Thor Ragnarok.
No, that wouldn't be bullshit. Tell us what happens in Thor Ragnarok.
Let's wait and see. In Thor Ragnarok, there's some context, which is the previous two Thor movies, as well as all the other MCU movies, but we'll just forget about that. Who cares? One of the things I like about Ragnarok is there is context, but you also really don't need it. You could just come into this and it's a self-contained story, and they tell you enough to understand the context without having to have seen 20 other movies, which is pretty cool. So it starts with Thor being imprisoned by this fire demon. I think his name was like Surtur.
He is a fire giant.
So Surtur is a fire giant who has Thor in a cage and is going on and on about how he is going to bring on Ragnarok, which is the destruction of Thor's home planet of Asgard. And he also drops this like important note, which is that the throne is currently undefended on Asgard. There's nobody there to protect it. And Thor's like, well, what about my dad, Odin? And he's like, dude, Odin's not there. And Thor's like, what? Odin's not there? This will be important later. And, Thor's like, whatever, I can beat things up. It seems like if I beat you up and steal your crown, you can't bring on Ragnarok. So that's what I'm going to do before you initiate Ragnarok, because once you do that, you're going to be like 10 times as giant. That's part of it, is this already pretty giant fire demon is going to get much more giant and powerful once its crown is reunited with the eternal flame, which is being held on Asgard as part of their collection of colonial spoils, perhaps you could call it.
And if I may interject for a moment, it's a really missed
Please.
Opportunity that they didn't use the song Eternal Flame in the movie.
It was a missed opportunity, I agree, to not use Eternal Flame in Thor Ragnarok. I do love that song. I will not go on a digression about it because I could say a lot. But so point being, Thor takes the crown and heads back to Asgard. When he gets back to Asgard, he finds out that Heimdall, is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah, Heimdall.
Heimdall, Idris Elba, he's gone, and Odin appears to be there, but Thor pretty quickly puts together that it's actually his mischievous brother Loki posing as Odin in a very funny scene where we see a play that is the mythologized Asgardian version of events of previous movies, basically telling the story of how Loki saved Asgard. It's this very like pro-Loki. Loki is a hero. There's a giant statue of Loki now, etc. And Thor's like, this isn't Odin, this is Loki. And does the thing where he throws his hammer and his hammer has to come right back to him. So he throws his hammer really far and then puts Loki in front of him. So the hammer's going to go through Loki and kill him unless he is like, okay, I admit it, I'm Loki, and changes back into Loki. And So Loki has been exposed and says he left Odin in New York City. So Thor and Loki take the Bifrost, I believe they call it, is the Bifrost, which is their way they can, travel other places real fucking fast, basically. We'll leave it at that for now. And so they go to New York, and Doctor Strange is there and takes them to his house, and they have some conversations and stuff. And I believe Doctor Strange is the one who tells them, Odin's in Norway. Mm-hmm. And they have a whole talk about Loki and how Loki's, an issue, whatever, etc. They end up going to Norway. They see Odin. Odin talks to them a little bit, says some things. I'm trying to remember the exact quote of what he says to them about the importance of Asgard not being as a physical location, but as a people. Those weren't his exact words, but something along those lines. And then he dies. Mm-hmm. He dies and kind of evaporates into some dust. And, Thor and Loki don't have that much time to say in their feelings about it, because suddenly, who shows up but Hela, who is Thor's long-lost sister, played by the wonderful Cate Blanchett. Wonderful Cate Blanchett in a very cool outfit with very good costume design. Mm-hmm. It's all good. And she's like, guess what? Now that Odin's dead, I can come back and reclaim my rightful role as ruler of Asgard. Because as it turns out, Hela and her dad conquered the 9 realms together. So 9 different worlds. They went out and conquered and colonized basically for Asgard. And that's how Asgard got all their wealth. That's how Asgard got all their power. Once they had that level of, control and maybe not all, but I'm sure there was some magical stuff predating that or whatever. But once they had all that, then Odin started kind of moving more into diplomacy and more peaceful resolutions to conflict and stuff. Because he's already got 9 realms worth of treasure and shit. He can afford to be a little more liberal at this point in his time. Hela got banished because Hela wasn't part of that. Hela was like, nah, we got to keep conquering worlds. We're really great at world conquering. Why would we stop now?
There's so many more.
There's so many more. And so now that Odin's gone, she shows up. She's like, this is what's up now. And so Loki and Thor try to get back to Asgard. They're all in the Bifrost, which looks pretty cool, honestly. It's like this rainbow tunnel. I like the way it looks. There's better CGI in this film than maybe any other Marvel film, in my opinion. Most of it looks good. And that's cool. And so they have this cool fight in the Bifrost. And what ends up happening is Hela ends up making her way back to Asgard, while Loki and Thor are spun off to this other world called Sakaar, which is the place for all lost and unloved things, basically. It's like the scrap heap of the universe or the multiverse or what the fuck ever. And they part ways with each other. They split off at different times. Thor suddenly, here we are, Act 2. Thor's on Sakaar, and there's a bunch of people who are trying to entrap him for God knows what means. But then this cool ship shows up, and on that cool ship is Tessa Thompson as Scrapper 142, and she's like, he's mine. You get the sense that she is a good fighter and has some sort of favored position here in this world. She's like, no, fuck all y'all. And she basically mows them all down with this cool, mecha gun thing. It's not a mecha.
Drunk the whole time.
Yeah, and she's drunk the whole time. We learn that she's, a raging alcoholic. She steps off her ship and is like, he's mine, in this really impressive way. And then drunkenly literally falls off the bridge. And it's good physical comedy. It's good stuff. So she puts this kind of disc on Thor's neck that allows her to control him. And she takes him somewhere. And when he next wakes up, he's on this weirdo tour guide thing where he's strapped into a chair that is moving through a hallway where visuals are being projected talking about what Sakaar is and how, Sakaar is this world, and the original person who came here was the Grand Master, and now he runs everything, and he has put together this wonderful contest that can give your life meaning, because if you're here on Sakaar, basically you're garbage, but now you can be part of the Grand Master's, like, gladiator-ish entertainment, basically. Yay. Thor's like, fuck this, obviously, but I forgot to mention, Hela smashed his hammer when they had their little fight before, so, and this is key. He's without his hammer for the whole rest of the fucking movie. He has no hammer. He has this weird control thing in his neck. He sees the Grandmaster, who is played by Jeff Goldblum, basically like disintegrate this guy he was pissed off at right next to him. Like, it's a kind of Wizard of Ozzy situation of this guy doesn't seem all that super powerful, but because he was the first one to show up in this space and kind of like learn the ropes and build the whole thing to serve him, he's like the top dog anyway, you know, and is able to make all these other more powerful people, aliens, creatures, etc., do his bidding, which is an interesting depiction of ways that power can work. And Loki's there. Thor runs into Loki. Loki's there. He's getting along better with the Grandmaster than Thor is. Thor ends up being pushed into the Contest of Champions, which is the Grandmaster's big, super violent gladiator contest that people watch for entertainment and bet on. And the big celebrities on Sakaar are like the champions from the Contest of Champions. And who is Thor put up against but the Incredible Hulk? Turns out that after the events of
Age of Ultron.
Avengers, Age of Ultron, which I barely remember. After that...
It's not worth remembering.
It's not worth remembering. Hulk ended up here. That's all that matters. And he's apparently been the Hulk for years. He has not switched back to Bruce Banner. He's just been in his raging out Hulk phase 4 years, like, recognizes Thor to a degree, but is not interacting with him as if they are friends or co-workers. But it's just Hulk smash, basically. And they have this whole fight. At a certain point, it appears that Thor's actually going to win. But then the Grandmaster makes the disc on his neck do the thing that makes him like get paralyzed and go on the ground. So Hulk is able to smash. And even though clearly the contest was rigged, technically the Hulk's the winner and Thor's not. And we learn more on Sakaar for a while. We find out Scrapper 142 was a Valkyrie, which was this elite fighting force on Asgard, who was the Valkyrie were almost all killed during the last big blowout with Odin and Hela, where they were having their power squabbles over who was going to run Asgard. And lots of Asgardians died, making Hela not be the ruler of Asgard, including apparently Valkyrie, Tessa Thompson's girlfriend, who we see in a flashback at a certain point. It's not really explained, but she makes a reference to how she only survived because, and then we see in flashback later on Hela coming at her and this other woman kind of getting in the way and dying, and Tessa Thompson's character, being very distraught. So clearly this was a person who was important to her. We know from outside of the film information that was a romantic interest, but for the Chinese market or whatever, we can pretend they were just good friends. Sean and I were talking a little about queer representation in Marvel before we started recording. We can talk about it more later. So that all happens. There's also this guy Korg, who's a rock monster played by Taika Waititi, who's around and kind of talking about trying to foment some kind of uprising amongst the oppressed of Sakaar. He says he's tried to start a revolution before, but it failed because he didn't have enough pamphlets, blah, 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 blah. At a certain point, all the plot machinations don't particularly matter for purposes of this recap, but eventually Thor and Hulk are able to, communicate. Hulk turns back into Banner. They decide that they are going to try to escape Sakaar and go back to Asgard in order to protect it from Hela. Takes Thor a while to get everybody on board. People aren't super into it, but eventually the Revengers, as he calls them, form of Valkyrie and Hulk and him, depending on which scene it is, maybe Loki, maybe not. There's a lot of back and forth with that. They end up escaping through this weird wormhole that is called the Devil's Anus in a ship that they commandeer. It is a party ship belonging to the Grand Master. They manage to escape. They also give some weapons to Korg, basically being like, hey, why don't you have a revolution? Because that's going to help us escape, honestly. So they do that. They go to Asgard. Meanwhile, I haven't even talked about what's going on back on Asgard. It's a mess. Hela shows up, kills a bunch of people. Heimdall is busy trying to get refugees hidden out in the woods in these structures. Most of the warriors are just getting killed by Hela. Scourge, who operates the Bifrost, played by Carl Urban, is an early convert to Hela, not because he believes in her or anything like that, but just because he sees that he's likely going to get killed otherwise. So he becomes kind of her right-hand man. They're trying to like shore up support on Asgard. There is none. None of the Asgardians want anything to do with Hela, but she does this thing that makes it kind of hard to say no of she resurrects a zombie army of all these dead soldiers who are buried underneath the palace, whatever it's called, on Asgard. She also resurrects her giant pet wolf from the past. So she's got a pretty strong force to be reckoned with here. We'll talk about this scene more later as it's kind of key to some of the themes we want to discuss, but there's a great scene where Hela takes Scourge into the palace. There's actually a clip from this scene at the beginning of every episode of our show where Cate Blanchett says, "Look at these lies." And if we were to play more of the clip, she would elaborate about how all of the art in Asgard representing itself, right? All of the paintings and murals and ceilings and everything depicting great events in Asgard history are only showing like garden parties and diplomatic meetings and handshakes and all sorts of stuff like that. But Hela smashes the ceiling and it all falls down. And then we see all this other art underneath that has been literally painted over because it's not convenient to the current Asgard self-view of what used to be the legacy of Asgard, which was one of colonization and death and imperialism and all of that. That's what Asgard used to celebrate as being their great story, but then that became inconvenient to the self-image. So much as Hela herself was banished, they also banished that history and wrote over it with like a new, friendlier, sunnier, happier history. Anyway, the Avengers come back to Asgard. Fighting Hela is not going to happen. Hela gets more power from Asgard, so she's only getting stronger and stronger. They have a ship now, so they're like, oh, another ship comes because then Loki and Korg and a bunch of other people from Sakaar also show up, so they've got a bigger ship. They're trying to evacuate Asgardians into the ship. They're just fighting Hela to kind of hold her off while they do that. They're no longer trying to really defeat her. They don't think that is possible. It starts to feel impossible that they could even hold her off long enough to get everybody out. So then Thor has the radical idea that maybe this entire journey wasn't actually about preventing Ragnarok. Maybe it was actually about making Ragnarok happen. And maybe in order to save these people, Asgard itself and all of its horrific history that is rising from the dead to consume it literally right now, just all needs to be destroyed in order for anyone to move forward. So Loki goes and intentionally moves that aforementioned crown into the eternal flame, bringing back the big fire monster guy who's now way bigger. He and Hela start fighting. That allows everybody else to escape, and they escape to become a diasporic people, no longer tied to a nation, because as Thor says, Asgard isn't a place, it's a people. So the Asgardians fly off into space to have the shitty events of the next movies happen. But that's Thor Ragnarok.
Yay!
Yay.
Good synopsisizing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do
So what?
you want to know what these movies have in common, Nicole?
Tell me, because they sound pretty different. Tell me what
They
Thor
sound
Ragnarok and
different.
Lisztomania.
But what they have in common is that both films feature the character of Thor, as we mentioned, playing key roles within imperialism and fascism. Within Lisztomania, Lisztomania is primarily preoccupied with the fascist origins, and Ragnarok is focused on the aftermath of imperialist colonialism, as well as what comes next. Both films especially focus on the mythology used to build and maintain the oppressive power, with an interest in the role of Norse mythology in particular. So they're both interfacing with Norse mythology. Lisztomania is really all about, in a lot of ways, all about like the construction of a fascist nation, while Thor Ragnarok is fundamentally about like the aftermath of imperialism, colonialism, and I don't want to say the rehabilitation of that, but the end of an imperialist society and moving forward from that. So there's two ends of it. It's two ends of not exactly the same thing, but two bad things. So
plus Thor.
Lots of Thor.
Two bad things and Thor.
And just Norse mythology sort of in general comes into play. But
so when did you first see these films?
Ragnarok, I saw probably opening weekend. I usually, or close to, like second week it came out. I see a lot of the Marvel movies when they come out because they're fun to see in the theater. This one looked particularly fun. They were going to have the Hulk in it and all that stuff. And they were advertising it using Led Zeppelin, so how am I not going to go see that? I've seen it many times since. It is definitely one of my favorite Marvel movies, if not my favorite. I don't know. I probably need to think about that more, but it's definitely one of the better ones that they've made. It's actually about like something sort of broader in an interesting way. And yeah, so I saw it back in 2017 when it first came out. Lisztomania is another one of those films that is like half the films that we've done almost this season, or at least half the episodes. This is the story. Is my buddy David was like, hey, let's watch this movie Lisztomania. And I said, what is it about? And he says, oh, it's supposed to be this weird Ken Russell like musical thing. So we watched it. And I was like, the fuck is this movie? This is the greatest thing. And I've watched it many, many times since then. It's probably, well, maybe not many. It's 5 or 6 times at least since then. And it is a movie that, because of the way it caricaturizes a lot of groups, I try to be a little hesitant about recommending it to people, because it's one of those ones where it's like, I don't know that I want somebody to come back to me and go like, why did you like this movie? Other than like the obvious, like there was a lot of dicks in that movie. Why did you like this movie? That's fine. It's got some questionable caricatures in it is one where I'm like, like that's not everybody's going to want to interface with that. So I try to be careful about that. But I really, really love what it's doing overall. I think I find the themes and sort of what it's exploring very interesting. I tend to be really down on biopics, particularly biopics of musicians. I mean, mostly like modern musicians, I'm down on that because those usually suck. But biopics are a thorny genre. Like a lot of them are just like, let's cram this person's whole life into an hour and a half or 2 hours or most of their life into this. And it's just kind of clumsy most of the time. They didn't really do that. They got very like, I appreciate that it's mostly just sort of representational. It's mostly metaphorical. It's not concerned with literal history. It's concerned with more of the impact of events and relationships than it is like, this is what actually happened. We'll talk more about that. And I think that's really genius about the movie, is that it's just like, there are threads and there are connections and there are things that are very, very important in what we are talking about in this movie, that if we were to just depict it literally, like you might, like it might be there, but it stretches. And I think that it is a movie that many people should see. I don't know about all people, but many people should see, because I think there's a lot. It's a dense text and there's a lot of dick in it. So
yeah, there is. It reminds me a little bit of I'm Not There, the Todd Haynes. Is it a biopic? Is it not? Of Bob Dylan, which similarly doesn't portray events that actually happened, but rather is stuff that is representative of and it's figurative rather than literal in a similar way as Lisztomania. So that was a connection I thought of. But yeah, I agree. I tend to prefer approaches to biopics that are like this or I'm Not There, rather than being like, I'm gonna try to just this happened, then this happened, then this happened, or like flashback structure or whatever fucking thing it is, trying to actually tell you someone's whole life. I prefer the less straightforward.
Yeah.
approaches.
And at that point, the only music biopic you need to see is Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, which is just a comedy making fun of all of them, but it covers the ground. Like, it's, you're like, okay, now I know how all of these movies work.
So should I talk about when I
talk
saw
about your experience? Sorry. Yeah.
My experience, my journey. I saw Lisztomania for the first time a few years ago with Sean. Sean was like, hey, Lisztomania is playing. You guys want to go see it? And my husband, also named Sean, for those of you who have been confused about that on the podcast, I often realize that could be extremely confusing because I'm going to be talking about two different Seans. But so the Seans and I and Jess went to.
Yeah, and Jess came too, yeah.
And Sean's wife, Jess, all went and saw Lisztomania, and I thought it was super interesting, was very glad I saw it, enjoyed it a lot. This was my second time watching it for the show, and it held up for me. I still like it a lot. Thor Ragnarok, I am not the Marvel fan that Sean Mannion is, but this was a film I was aware of and more eager to see than most Marvel movies, although it was before I really got burnt out on them. But I was like, oh, Taika Waititi, he did What We Do in the Shadows. I want to see his take. This looks colorful and fun. And I saw it and I thought it was fucking great. Like, I love Thor Ragnarok. I still love Thor Ragnarok. It is my favorite Marvel movie. It is probably my favorite superhero movie. I cannot think of a single superhero movie that I like more than Thor Ragnarok. As for me, where I'm sitting, it's the height of the genre. Like, it was all downhill from there, except for Black Panther. Black Panther is the only other Marvel movie besides Thor Ragnarok that I've watched multiple times. But I've watched Ragnarok more than Black Panther, because Ragnarok's a movie I'll just put it on. It's kind of good to like you can watch the first act and not the rest of it, and it's enjoyable. So I liked it a lot in the theaters. I thought it was a good time at the movies. Then when it came out on streaming, it was on Netflix for a while, and I watched it a couple times there. Eventually I bought the Blu-ray, because I'm like, I don't want to have to trust that this borrowed Disney Plus account is going to be here forever. Plus, you never know when Disney Plus is just going to change a movie on you in one way or another. So yeah, I've seen it a lot. I will continue to watch it a lot. And that is my experience with those films. What kinds of experiences did critics have with these films?
From the New York Times, we have Richard Eder reviewing Lisztomania, and this Richard, again, dicks showing up in relationship to Lisztomania. Manic and extremely funny, then it relapses into a noisy bit of pretentiousness in the manner of its predecessor, Tommy, full of flashing lights, satin space suits, chrome lucite furniture, and mock agony. I feel like Richard Eder was like, oh, I thought this was supposed to be a fun movie. And I'm just like, I mean, yes, but also, like, even from the beginning, there's threads of commentary throughout the film. So certainly
they're setting it up from the beginning where it's going.
As soon as Wagner is introduced. Yeah.
He's literally introduced by being anti-Semitic in a way where he's also telling on himself.
Yeah.
Like, he's basically accusing some Jewish guy of being cheap when he's actually being cheap himself, which was an interesting way to introduce the character. He's just anti-Semitic right off the bat, but also blaming shit on Jews that's actually his own shit, which is an accurate depiction of a piece of anti-Semitism for sure.
Yeah, and even if you're not necessarily interfacing with that part of it, like early on, not the first scene, but like when he's with his wife after the concert scene, there's a very explicit conversation about how she was from higher society, you know, and he was low class, he was a servant, and she ran out, and they talk about that. This class system that affected them and affected their relationship, and is why they're actually not married. They live in sin. But, you know, so those things are there throughout. Also in the New York Times, we've got Manola Dragas reviewing Thor Ragnarok, who says, through no fault of their likable star, Chris Hemswoth, the Thor movies have been largely forgettable, memorable mostly for their upstaging antics of his brother Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston, and as a bad fit for Natalie Portman, Thor's former love interest now mercifully banished into the storytelling cornfield. Ragnarok tries hard to change that profile and mostly succeeds by knocking its big blonde beauty consistently down to size. It makes sense for all sorts of reasons, including that superheroes can so easily appear to be on the wrong side of history, especially those who look like Aryan cartoons. I thought that was an interesting little clip from that, because that's very relevant to what we're going to be talking about.
Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, because part of what I like about Ragnarok is, look, I've never gotten all the way through Thor: The Dark World. Even though I have a Blu-ray of it in my house, I did not pay for this Blu-ray.
It's not a great movie.
It was actually gifted. It was gifted to me by a friend of the show, former guest, returning champion, Che Broadnax, had a copy that he also did not pay for. And he's like, why don't you just take this? And I was like, great. And then I tried to watch it, and I was like, I can't watch this shit.
It's not a good movie.
But I'm interested in it. I meant to rewatch it before this podcast, but was like, I don't want to watch Thor: The Dark World. But I thought it would be instructive as to the way that this one is largely considered to be like a real like course corrector with the Thor films. I like the first Thor film. It's actually, I like it more than most Marvel movies. I don't think it's a great film. I think there are some real bad things about it.
Yeah.
But I enjoy it. It's Dude, Where's My Hammer? Or whatever. Yeah. It's fun. I like Chris Hemswoth. I have liked Chris Hemsworth since he was in Cabin in the Woods. That was the first thing I saw him in. Yeah, and then when he was playing Thor, I was like, oh, it's the guy from Cabin in the Woods. Oh, he's funny. He's still funny. I think he's great. He's my favorite Chris. But, yeah. But anyway, point being, the comment about, you know, looking like an Aryan cartoon, my understanding is there's some problematic stuff in Thor: The Dark World as they fight the Dark Elves or whatever, and the functioning of the Dark Elves is as this kind of some racialized other that when we get into talking more about anti-Semitism as an ideology later, I had a theory where I was like, I bet I can talk about how the Dark Elves are anti-Semitic, but then I didn't watch the fucking movie, so I can't really make an argument about anti-Semitism and the Dark Elves, but I can make an argument about anti-Semitism more generally, and a lot of stories, whether they're superhero or otherwise, about great leaders and things where there are racialized others that need to be battled in order to whatever some Aryan people, you know, like criticisms people have made of the Lord of the Rings movies, for example, or there's some related stuff going on in Harry Potter and related stuff going on in tons of similar fantasy things that really gets kind of, they fix it in Ragnarok, because they delve into it and they're like, yeah, Asgard actually was this like is an imperialist power. The wealth was built through colonization, and you know, it's not as simple as I would imagine. This changes, Ragnarok changes a little bit the events of the Dark World and the relationship between the Dark Elves and Asgardians in general into something a little bit more complicated, and that's cool. And yeah, we're gonna talk about
more
Norse
about
mythology and iconography, and specifically the role of Thor as a potential Aryan figurehead in both of these films. Whereas like in Lisztomania, you've got Robot Thor, and he is billed as Thor in the credits. Like, it is clearly supposed to be Thor. They make a crack about how he looks like a character out of a comic book, so he's not even Norse mythology Thor.
No, his costume is exactly out of the comic book without a cape. So.
Yeah, he is comic book Thor, who Wagner is trying to animate into the Ubermensch who's going to help foment white supremacist nationalism in Germany in order to save it by his own extremely racist logic. And then in Ragnarok, you've got Thor, who could be the figurehead of that, but rejects it and instead takes this much more radical path, undermining his own colonial legacy.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
It is very cool. Did you see what Ebert and Ebert.com said about these movies?
I sure did. And I was very taken by what Ebert said about Lisztomania, because he gave it 3 stars, which is very cool. He notoriously gave The Devils either like 1 star or 0 stars. And
I can see him not liking that movie. Yeah.
I can share his Devils review in the show notes because I love it so much. It's super bitchy, and I love The Devils. Like, I love The Devils. Ebert hates The Devils, but he's one of the people who I have time for his Devils hatred because he's so funny about it. Okay. So, like, it's actually a well-written review. But so I was a little surprised when he liked Lisztomania so much, because I'd read a few reviews where he just shits on Ken Russell.
Yeah.
But in this one, he said Ken Russell's Lisztomania has little, if anything, to do with the life and music of Franz Liszt, or of Wagner, Beethoven, Chopin, and the other unfortunates it tramples on the way to its manic conclusion. No, this isn't a biography, not even in the sense that Russell ravaged poor Tchaikovsky in The Music Lovers. It's a berserk exercise of demented genius, and on that level, I want to make my praise explicit. It functions and sometimes even works. Most people will probably despise it. I think that it is such a funny, positive review, and it's just on that level, it functions and sometimes even works.
As an exercise of demented genius. Yeah.
I think he's not wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think the thing that I think he's kind of touching on it, really love about Lisztomania is because in a lot of ways it's doing what film can do and we rarely try to do, which is saying that when we make a film, we are very much working within the dream space, psychological space, relational, psychological relationships between things. Like, that's how film works. And, we use that for the most part to do like over the shoulder shots and like conversations where you cut between different sides of people and they can create relationships between those, like how film works. What is truly, I think, genius about Lisztomania, and still Tommy, but to a lesser degree, is that Ken Russell was just like, this is a narrative. There's a narrative thread. There's a beginning, middle, and end. You could put the 3-act structure across this. It'll fit. I'm sure. I didn't try, but you could. But then he said, like, okay, there's going to be clear characters. There's going to be clear dialogue. But this is going to be figurative. This is going to be like a nightmare, like a dream. It's dream space. And as he's just like, we're just going to work in that figurative psychological space where, honestly, like, I don't know if the description that I gave, the synopsis that I gave the film, makes any sense as a story, because honestly, like, it's a film that just kind of flows from one piece to the next and from one sort of situation to the next, and tells you who characters are in these broad figurative strokes. I mean, even Cosima, I forgot to mention that she has a voodoo doll of her father at one point that she uses to sort of torment him at different points because she wants revenge on him, honestly, for understandable reasons of him choosing not to be there. And I mean, I agree with Ebert, this berserk exercise of demented genius. And I do think it works. I think as he says, a lot of people do not want to watch this movie because they're like, what is this going on? It's like, don't think about what's going on. Just absorb it. Just absorb it. Just let it wash over you, and don't try to explain it later. Don't try to do what we're gonna do. Don't try to explain this movie.
Yeah, it's not a great movie where for people who every moment of watching needs to be like, but what's happening? You have to be able to just be like, I'm just going to sit back and let this movie happen and enjoy the experience and maybe analyze what was going on later. Mm-hmm. But which is what I try to do generally with movies anyway. If I'm analyzing a film in too much depth while I'm watching it for the first time, it's a bad sign about that film.
It's a bad movie.
Because it meant I needed to do that in order to entertain myself. Because otherwise I'd be like not able to engage. What I really try, what I really try to do whenever I watch a film for the first time is I generally try to just experience it and figure it out later.
Yeah.
Because it'll remove me from having the emotional experience if I'm technically breaking it down too much while I'm watching it. That's what I do when I'm alienated from the emotional experience I'm supposed to be having.
And I think one of the things, because I know some people just try to do that, like whenever they watch a film, it's just like from the beginning, I'm like, no, you got to watch the whole film first. It's like when
You're missing the film. Yeah.
It's like when people don't watch a whole film or they watch the beginning of the film. Oh, the film is about this. Did you watch the whole thing? This is also a problem that I have with some serialized things. Like people watch the first half of a season of a show or the first episode of a season of a show. And they're like, oh, they're doing this thing. It's like they have not finished the story yet. You don't know what they're doing till they finish the story. This happens in comics too, which is relevant to this conversation. But because comics will often have a story that takes place over, months. Well, social media does not deal with that well. They're like, they can't do this. Why are they doing this? It's like they're setting up a story. Let them finish it, and then let's shit on them.
Yeah.
But yeah, you got to absorb the whole story first, and then you can understand it or not understand it. But like, get the whole thing in there first. Or if you just like, they're starting in a way where I'm like, this bullshit. I'm like, okay, that's fair. But just say like, they started a way that was bullshit, and I don't want to know what the next thing's going. Okay, that's fine. But gotta watch the whole thing.
Or if you genuinely know and are right, because that happens.
Happens for sure.
Yeah, I don't want to, make too broad of a rule of like, you can't pass judgment on a film until you've seen it. I don't think that's true, actually. I just think that you are missing out on the experience of cinema if you are trying to analyze and figure out what you think about a film from the first frame. You're missing the film. That is not, for me, the most rewarding way to engage with an art form that I have put a lot of stock into. Why would I do that? But curious about Ebert. Ebert had unfortunately passed on by the time Thor Ragnarok came out, but Ebert.com lives on, and Matt Zoller Seitz reviewed Thor Ragnarok on Ebert.com. What did he have to say?
He also gave it 3 stars, and he said Hemsworth's charisma holds Thor Ragnarok together whenever it threatens to spin apart, which unfortunately is often. I can see how that's an interpretation when you watch it for the first time. But as you were saying earlier, like, it's very tight. And I mean, I remember that being, and I think I saw it before you, and I was praising it to you because I was like, it's one of the comic book films. One of the things, I think it is probably in some respects, as you said, like probably the best comic book film in some respects because it best captures one of the experiences of reading comic book where like watching that movie, I could tell you like, for that kind of comic book, I was like, this is where one of the issues would end. This is where one of the issues would end. This is where one of the issues would end. It had a structure that felt a lot like a comic book. It weaved in characters from elsewhere, but in a way where you didn't necessarily have to know a whole lot. It's like Doctor Strange shows up because we need to talk to a guy because we need to find his dad. Who's he going to talk to? He's got Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange deals with magic shit. These guys are magic shit. So that's what's going to happen. Thor's got to run into somebody in space, so he's got like allies. So, okay, we'll bring in Valkyrie, who we haven't introduced. So new character, great. But we need somebody who's already out there. Who do we got? In one of the movies, like they sent Hulk out into space. Thor and Hulk as a team up, that's great. Like, okay, cool. And so, they do that. And I think, that's like when you're reading, some of the more solid comic book stories in this genre of comic book. Obviously, not necessarily all comics are not necessarily this kind of comic, despite what some people think. And I think that it works. It's very tight in that sense. Yeah.
And also the look of it, honestly, the design, the art direction.
It's amazing.
Is I mean, let's be real. Most of these comic book movies look like shit.
A lot of their design is not good, and one of the reasons why the design in this is so good is because they go back to the source. Like there's a significant Kirby inspiration, which is a thing that just is, and which one of the things that's so marvelous about that, not to bring Marvel in, but just to say, like, is that he had. Sometimes people like see his work for the first time and they're kind of like, I don't know, the people look kind of weird. It's like, yeah, but you look past that to the design. He made things look unique. Everything like these characters would look unique, even though there were similarities. Like if you looked at, because he was the artist for Jack Kirby, he was the artist for everything Marvel in the 60s for a long time. He would at least start them with minor exceptions. Like he wasn't the artist on Spider-Man. He wasn't the artist on Doctor Strange. Those were both Steve Ditko. But he did this design work. And if you would see like these Thor, and he's like, well, okay, I got to do space Vikings basically, or I got to do, superhero Vikings. They could all look the same. Like somebody else might make, oh, well, just all look like, but if you look at like the artwork on it, they all look just unique, interesting, different. Like they all have a feel to them. And they brought that here, which honestly isn't as present in the other Thor movies even. Like there are the unfortunately underserved sort of sidekicks of Thor, the Warriors 3 characters who are his 3 buddies, the big heavy guy, the blonde guy, and the Asian guy. And they kind of are blend in together in all of these films. Like they kind of don't really factor in to Ragnarok very much at all.
No, they show up and get killed.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. They die. And
Hela kills them. Yeah. And it's like a thing. They exist as an important marker of Hela's growing dominance, but they don't really exist as characters.
No, it's kind of a bummer that they never got to be, but they were very unique in the books. Like they have like this unique feel and vibe that is part of like his design skill, and they leaned into that, and I think it helps the movie a lot. It's just down to things like just that they had those lines and circles on things, or even just the lines that are on like Valkyrie's face. I think, she's got those makeup lines. Like these are inspired by, they're not the same thing, but it really, really helps the film.
It really, like Ragnarok Thor has a distinct look just because of the kind of like scrappy armor that gets put together when he's on Sakaar, and he has the face paint that you were talking about that's like never explained. It's just there. And there's a lot of the rooms there, like you said, there'll be graffiti on the walls, or there will just be like weird designs painted on the walls. And I know a lot of that was taken from the comics, and even the kinds of color palettes they work with feel a lot more comic booky than most Marvel or any other comic book films, and that is delightful. And it's why wouldn't you do that?
Why wouldn't you embrace the weird and embrace like the heightened thing? It's also a problem in the comics themselves today, is that a lot of design, honestly, as much as there are artists working in it that do wonderful work, like it's because of how big it's grown, they've all grown, there's been a lot of homogenization of design, and it makes things look a lot pretty boring. But I will say, like with that, one of the things, just to mention like this design thing and to bring it to a specific example of where I think like Marvel really failed, is when Marvel just recently adapted one of Kirby's other works, which was entirely something of his that Marvel let him do in the 70s. I think it was the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. The Eternals, which originally was not part of the regular Marvel universe. This was like a whole thing that Kirby was doing on his own. He wrote and drew it. One of the criticisms of the design of the movie, which, you know, is I don't hate the designs in that movie. I think they are pretty generic looking, but one of the criticisms is they just didn't use any of his design work really. There's a little bit of the lines and circles stuff going on, but they abandoned that when it's one of the few things that is like wholly his. But there's a lot of like Kirby stuff that's being adapted where they have they've replaced his design with uninspired design. That's affected over at DC as well. I mean, I haven't seen the Snyder cut of Justice League, but the villains in that, Darkseid and Apocalypse and all of those characters are also Kirby designs. Were also like he has like a whole, like there was supposed to be this whole new gods mythology that he was doing with those characters that eventually kind of fell apart. But there's spectacular design there, and that's all abandoned in these live action things, and it becomes very homogenized and crappy. But as you said, Ragnarok really stands out for having this, and it's beautiful, really.
It's rare to have a movie with this much CGI where I actually like the way the CGI looks. Not like it's fine, but I actually like it. I'm like, oh, you did something that looks good and distinct. Amazing, you know, amazing.
And I think when we criticize that, I think one of the things that we should also emphasize, because of some things that are out in the news right now.
Oh, yes,
Marvel
please.
mistreats people, which is not surprising, you know, in this thing. And I do think is bad. And, you know, that needs to be rectified. There's a whole bigger conversation about the VFX world and what needs to be fixed there. But when we talk about like, okay, this isn't working, the CGI isn't working, we're not criticizing the visual effects artists.
Definitely
criticizing the decision makers, because they're the ones saying make this look this way, and there's such like uninspired choices, like the producers and those people who are like, yeah, let's make all these monsters. Like, this is one of my big complaints for things, is all these CGI monsters, you could do anything, and they all are nondescript. They all none of them look like anything.
I'm not saying it's poorly executed CGI on a technical level. I'm saying it's bad character design. It's bad set design. And that's not the CGI artists making those decisions. No. And then the other piece of it,
it's not even the designers. It's the people who are like, this is what we want the design to look like. Because also I don't want to shit on the designers either, because some of those people are incredibly talented and offer up some amazing, like when you see sometimes like the behind the scenes stuff where they're like, here's designs we didn't use. You're like, why the fuck didn't you use that? Anyway.
For sure. No, we're talking about the suits who are like, this movie made a lot of money, and people like Nolan movies, make it darker, whatever, you know, like I'm not talking about artists here. I am talking about executives. And then the other piece of it I extra want to say, especially because we're talking about a Taika Waititi movie, right after an unfortunate Vanity Fair clip was being circulated as part of the promotion of Thor Love and Thunder, where Taika Waititi was shitting on the CGI in Thor Love and Thunder, and a lot of people very understandably got pissed off at that because it's a bad look. And also, as Sean was alluding to, CGI artists, especially the ones working for Marvel, are being mistreated horrifically. So if you're going to talk shit about the CGI, you have to be very specific about who you're aiming it at and not punching down on people who are already being exploited. And then the other piece of it is, aside from how badly the people who animate for Marvel are largely getting paid and how quickly they need to work, there's also the fact that they're getting jerked around all the time and being like, change it. Yeah, change this, change that. And like everybody knows about the like horrific situation for the people doing the CGI for the movie Cats, for example, and how they were in an impossible situation. And that was part of why the CGI in the final film was like incomplete, basically, because they were like, we got to get this trailer together, put everything into the trailer, and then you've got like a month to finish the entire rest of the movie, or whatever the insane schedule was. That's every Marvel movie.
Honestly, like a lot of their work was very good. It's just that they couldn't complete their work. I mean, the movie itself was garbage.
Are you calling Cats garbage? It is the finest garbage in the land.
Is it funny? Is it fun to watch with people and be like, this this is crazy, and why the fuck did they make this movie this way? Yes, it is absolutely that. Is it a fun cinematic experience? Does it have some value? Absolutely. Is it a terribly directed, questionably performed,
poorly conceived on
giant
every
pile
level?
of shit? Yes, it is also that.
But it's the finest pile of shit.
I don't know
Anyway.
about that, but yes.
Anyway, I wanted to share that Thor Ragnarok is one of the better reviewed films we've done on this show. Rotten Tomatoes has it 93% fresh with critics and 87% fresh with audiences. Like, there's people who hate it, some critics and some audiences, largely because of the humor, it seems like, or for some other reason it wasn't fitting with what they wanted out of the next Thor movie. And it baffles me. Obviously, I've said, as far as I'm concerned, this is the best superhero movie, so I don't get that. But it was largely, it is largely held in high regard. I think at this point, its reputation has grown over the years. Even I feel like when it first came out, there was a little bit more, oh, I don't know, it's super jokey, and then as more Marvel movies came out, people were like, actually, relatively speaking, this is pretty good.
Yeah, and it's one that should have been structurally and approach-wise a lot more of a model. And I really hope that, I mean, they're going to keep doing Marvel stuff, but I really hope after the current spate of things that they're looking at, here's what we did with Ragnarok and what worked. Here's what we did with Black Panther and what worked, not just brought us in money, but brought us in acclaim, and go like, okay, what worked with those? It's that they mostly stand on their own. They fit in. They're part of the larger storyline. They fit into all that stuff. You can bring in other characters from there. But it's a thing on its own, and it's not trying to tie up loose ends from something else. It's not trying to, it's addressing like what happened next. Like both at the end of Age of Ultron, the last time we saw Thor or the Hulk, like both of them like went off on their own, but separately, but they didn't, and we just had to figure, okay, let's find out what they're doing. So hopefully they do that, because the other stuff has been a little bit like overstuffed and underdeveloped. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, it's all good. Meanwhile, Lisztomania on Rotten Tomatoes is 45% fresh with critics, 62 with audiences. And if more of the reviewers who were reviewing films in 1975 were among the Rotten Tomatoes aggregated reviews, I think that critical assessment would be even lower, because we read that Ebert review. Ebert was really an outlier in giving it 3 stars. It was mostly like, this is dog shit, this is dog shit, this is dog shit. When we have a couple amusing quotes from some like local papers talking about Lisztomania, such as Robin Wells wrote in the Lawton Constitution, this bizarre mating is being touted as Lisztomania. Ringo Starr plays the role of the Pope. What else? Oh yes, Wagner was also dragged into this affair. A couple of his works were retitled Master Race and Rape, Pillage, and Clap. So much for the Nazis. Okay. And William E. Sacramento in the Lowell Sun said, I like this one because as we've established, I love The Devils. And this excerpt starts with, "The Devils was one of the most disgusting films ever made." If you think The Devils is disgusting, you should take a look at the history of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Just gonna put that out there. Having taken a look at Tchaikovsky and Mahler, Russell now gives us his view of pianist-composer Franz Liszt. The entire film looks like a drug addict's prayer, which is very poetic.
That's clever.
I don't know why that's a bad thing, though. Lisztomania has Ringo Starr as the Pope and Franz Liszt marching around with Adolf Hitler in some sort of tribute to Nazism. That didn't happen.
And that is a complete misunderstanding of what's going on.
And it's not
like
that...
I can understand how you just feel like, the fuck is going on with this movie? And then you're like, well, there's Hitler and there's this guy. I guess this is...
Yeah, but honestly, like, I understand being like, I don't know what the fuck is going on with this movie, but if you were paying any attention to the movie, you would have to be coming from a very particular perspective to not understand that Hitler is the villain of this movie.
Yes.
He's literally the antagonist.
And
like, or, I mean, Hitler's not in it, but Wagner, who becomes Hitler-ish,
becomes Franken-Hitler.
becomes Franken-Hitler as he moves from being a half-assed communist into like, you know what's really hot though is fascism. I mean, they're not calling it that, but like what he's describing, what he is trying to foment is, you know, the beginnings of fascism. And obviously that is Ken Russell's point, as then he makes him into Franken-Hitler. And he's anti-Semitic the whole time. And all of that is portrayed extremely negatively to the point of being like childishly heavy-handed, if anything. So to view this as any sort of tribute, I'm just like, look, I get not understanding what the fuck is happening in the film. That's fine. But we're not that adrift that is unclear. You would have to have like really checked out and just not even be trying and just being looking for things to be offended at. Like if you don't like Ken Russell's treatment of fascism and Hitler, if you have criticisms of that, great. I'm not saying like, you know, this is an unimpeachable cinematic approach, but is not pro-Nazi.
No, it's definitely not that.
And I literally don't know how you could get that from it unless
you're not paying attention.
And not even just not paying attention, because it's not even like the context tells you. The mise en scène tells you. Just what you're seeing in the fucking frame and what you're hearing at any given moment is pretty clear.
Telling you exactly what it is. Yeah.
You know, this isn't as we were talking about Marilyn Manson a little bit earlier, and or we're on our Google Docs at least talking a little bit about Lisztomania and The Wall and fascist rock star imagery, and, you know, which is Marilyn Manson just bit really The Wall. I don't even know if he's seen Lisztomania, but there's
when I think about it, I hadn't really thought about that before, because you were pointing out that like, oh, he probably took it from this like rock star to fascism idea that's in like Lisztomania. And I was like, oh, and actually when I started thinking about the imagery of what I can remember from Antichrist Superstar for the music video, I'm like, actually, that kind of, I think it's probably The Wall. I mean, it's definitely
totally
like
Wall.
Very like Nazism sort of like inspired, like what he was doing there. It's definitely The Wall.
But The Wall and Lisztomania, I think, share a little bit of DNA. They're interested in some of the same themes, which is why I made what I think is a mistake and was like, Marilyn Manson just ripped off Lisztomania, because I just was not thinking about the existence of The Wall at the time. And I'm like, oh no, he actually ripped off The Wall. But
because we can't watch The Wall.
Yeah, that's true.
Because
we can't watch
Pink
The Wall.
Floyd will not let us watch The Wall.
Yeah.
What's his name? Roger, whatever his name is. He's like, no, I don't like that movie. You can't watch
Roger Waters.
Roger Waters. We're not allowed to watch that movie. And I'm just like, okay, but like the version that I've seen is just awesome. So
well, maybe someday we will be able to watch The Wall. A lot of people watched Thor Ragnarok in theaters. It made $315 million domestically. 538 million worldwide or internationally, for a total of $854-ish million total, which is pretty good. I can't find any figures for how much money Lisztomania made, but everybody says it was none. Yeah, it was, and it wasn't one of those. I don't see this movie making a whole lot of money. So no, and it didn't have some like it's a cult favorite for a very niche audience, but it's not like it then was like a big midnight movie thing or huge on VHS or anything like that. It was not. In terms of awards, Lisztomania, I'm not aware of anything it was nominated for or won.
I know it didn't win anything.
Ragnarok was nominated for like tons of sci-fi type awards. It won a few. It was nominated for some like MTV awards, Kids' Choice Awards, that kind of thing. It was a well-received film. It was a well-received film, much more so than Lisztomania.
So that's sort of so let's take a quick ad break, and then we'll be back in just a second. So
yeah, we'll come back to talk all about what these films reflect about one another, as well as the audience watching, in terms of iconography, Norse mythology, fascism and imperialism, anti-Semitism, all that good stuff, the power of rock and roll. But after we pay some bills, so
here we go. Okay, we're back.
And we are back. That was some advertising.
It likely was. I can't remember it. Like, my brain just blanked out on it. But, like, I'm sure I will remember it in my dreams, and it will be awkward.
Educational, informational, salutational, muppetational.
Speaking of words, so we talked a little bit about what these films have to do with each other. I think we're going to focus on, I think if we really wanted to, we could probably dig in a lot, because I think, one, as we talked about, Lisztomania actually is fairly dense in terms of what it's trying to do. And I think that there's a lot that can be said about what Taika Waititi and the screenwriters put into Ragnarok. But there's kind of three.
And also how it.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and also the thing about Ragnarok is how it sits in relation to other Marvel films, other Thor films, etc., makes even more to dive into in terms of the meaning beyond just what happens in the film itself.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. There's a lot is what
there's
I'm
a
saying.
lot. But we kind of wanted to focus on like three things. One of them would be sort of how these approach fascism and imperialism, which are not the same thing, but are
related,
adjacent. We want to talk about the iconography that is used in both of them, because they both heavily lean into that, and transforming art / mythology / culture. These are kind of the three major things that we wanted to talk about with these three films. So when it comes to fascism and imperialism, as we said, like, Lisztomania's interest is mostly in the rise of fascism and sort of setting the table for fascism. Not even really the rise of fascism. It's really like, let's set the ideological framework for a fascist state, while Ragnarok is dealing with imperialism and sort of the aftermath of imperialism. Like, what happens to that state, the imperialist state, and when it is brought down, essentially, like when it is revealed for being what it is. So
yeah, and I mean, Lisztomania is almost analogous to like the White Ribbon, right, in terms of what it's about. You've seen the White Ribbon, right?
I need to see the White Ribbon. I haven't.
Oh, you need to.
I need to see the White Ribbon. I haven't seen it.
The White Ribbon is about early 20th century Germany and conditions that, according to Hanukkah, at least, can help give rise to fascism.
Yeah,
basically. So it's very analogous, very, very different film, but somewhat analogous concerns in this department than Lisztomania. So yeah, so Lisztomania and the White Ribbon are kind of similar. And then, Lisztomania isn't really talking about imperialism per se, but just because they're not there yet, right? Because fascist Germany was imperialist,
100%.
right? They were expanding out beyond, but that's not what Wagner's talking about yet, right? Like, Wagner is talking about the idea of the German people and a very racist form of German nationalism, and how he's, become disillusioned with communism way earlier than anyone should have gotten disillusioned with what would become 20th century communism, at least. He's a poser, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's a poser, and he was into communism because that was the thing. And then he's like, but he was only really into communism.
Well, I think, go ahead.
I'm trying to think of how to put it exactly.
I think it's what you're saying about him being a poser. He doesn't have substance of his own, What he's doing, and I think was very relevant when we talk about the rise of fascism and fascist people, he does not have substance or a real belief system of his own. His belief system is basically, I want to be at the top. And I think that's very well established with Wagner from the beginning, from his first appearance, and how he's glomming on to Liszt. And just in case, we talked about how this film isn't like literal, but it is true that there is a direct relationship between Liszt, not just the familial relationship that was mentioned. There's a direct relationship between Liszt and Wagner, in that in music circles, classical music circles, like there's an acknowledgement that Wagner, quote, borrowed or stole and it's mentioned in the movie, from Liszt in terms of musical themes and stuff like that. It's because he has no substance of his own, is essentially the point. And much like fascists, they have no substance of their own. They have no real belief of their own other than that I should be on top. There's no reason they should be, usually. It's just, well, I should be because I want to be, because they're children. And that's why he's so often depicted as a little boy in this. Until the end, he's that outfit, that little sailor outfit. He's wearing this weird little sailor outfit for most of his appearances in the film, and it's absurd, but it's also like very much commenting on like this. He is a little boy. He is a pathetic little boy.
Right. And his interest in communism was also this really weird perversion of communism, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
He had this vision of there being like a leader of the people.
Yeah.
Who like rises up and like this very, narcissistic, individualistic, ironically, vision of communism. He just wants to be the star of something.
Yes.
It can be communism. It can be fascism. He doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
He really doesn't care, because it's not about the system. It's not about the ideology. It's about him being on top, which in theory shouldn't be a thing in communism. Obviously, we saw how 20th century communist states operated. I can give some reading suggestions if anyone wants to hear pro-communist critiques of 20th century communist states, for example. You can read Emma Goldman's My Disillusionment with Russia, and that'll cover most of it, including stuff that happened afterwards, because same problematic dynamics. Problematic is way too light a descriptor, actually. Same fucked dynamics. Yeah, but
and there is they're both dealing with this, and as you said, like fascism does tend to lead to imperialism. Like it's like, well, we're on top, we need to be on top everywhere.
Right. Fascism can be imperialism, but imperialism is not necessarily fascism.
Yes. And there was a definition. You pulled a useful article, and I just grabbed like the first paragraph because I was like, okay, this actually like sums up things decently, just to like differentiate a little bit. Fascism is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism. It is a movement based on rejection of social theories. Fascists sought to unite their nation into a totalitarian state based on ancestry and culture. Imperialism, on the other hand, is not entirely as radical or authoritarian as fascism. It is the policy of acquiring new lands and territories to enhance or increase one's influential power. And actually, reading that again, I actually would now argue that Taika Waititi's position on Asgard would be that Asgard was a fascist state.
It could definitely be. That occurred to me. I think that's arguable.
I mean, I can't speak for him, but I think that there's a depiction there, right? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it was it's a fascist state under Hela.
Yes, it's definitely that. I think there might be an argument for it having had been a fascist state under Odin previously.
But it moved into a more benevolent empire. Benevolent in quotes. I don't know what the political structure is on Asgard. There's a king, or what are they? What's it? Whatever.
It's king. Yeah.
It's a king. It's not democratic, right?
No.
But it's a monarchy, right? Is basically what we have there. But I think the same thing occurred to me. There's a lot of very fashy elements to Hela hard as that is for me to say because I like Hela so much. I mean, she's a villain. What she wants to do is terrible, but I really like Cate Blanchett in that role. And sidebar, I have read criticisms and heard criticisms of people saying Cate Blanchett is phoning it in. And all I have to say about that is if Cate Blanchett did this performance phoning it in, then who are you to second guess Cate Blanchett's choices? Because clearly phoning it in was the correct decision to make here. Because it's awesome.
Because I mean,
she's awesome. Should she win an Oscar? No. But is she having a great time? Yes. And am I having a great time? Yes. So.
And when she does these movies that are honestly like more of a, it's not like a challenging acting job. It's just probably more of a paycheck. Like there's this or there's the Ocean's 8 movie that she's in. Like, is she as good as she is in? Yeah, she's great in that too. But is it like the thing that she's doing in other films? No, because she doesn't need to. Because the role does not require it. These are not dense roles, honestly.
It's not like anyone else in Thor Ragnarok. And I think there are a lot of great performances in Thor Ragnarok. I think it's a wonderful cast. I think they're doing a great job. I haven't seen Love and Thunder yet, but however good or terrible it may be, I want to see these actors play these characters again because I enjoy that very much, inclusive of Cate Blanchett, but like not discounting Tom Hiddleston, who I love as Loki. As I've mentioned, I obviously love Chris Hemswoth as Thor. I love Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie. There's all these Taika Waititi regulars also in smaller roles, like Rachel House, is that her name, who plays Topaz? Yeah, Rachel House playing Topaz, Carl Urban playing Scourge. There's like
he goes to his New Zealand folks,
and it's nice. It adds.
There's also Sam Neill in a tiny little role.
There is Sam Neill in a tiny little role, and it really elevates the material because you really do have this crackerjack cast who are all, and Mark Ruffalo's good too. Like and Jeff Goldblum's good. They're all good. They're all good. They're all bringing something. But we're here to talk about fascism, not just how much I like the Ragnarok cast.
Yeah,
so,
and
but yeah, I agree that.
There's
there
an
are
argument
fascist elements, but what's more like not even an argument, but is just there is that Asgard was empire built on colonialism and imperialism. Like that is just text. That's not an interpretation. And similarly to how Lisztomania is, it's just text that it's about fascism specifically, and it's about a specific fascism that did become imperialist, but that's not what it's concerned.
And it's one of the things that I also, watching it again this last week, the more times you watch things, the more times you see like certain details. But one thing that I noticed this time and that I appreciate with Russell is because his interest in fascism here in a lot of ways is his interest is corruption. It's corruption of art. And he sees art as, and this is something we talk a little bit more about later maybe, but he sees art as something that's is a good and arguably, maybe is a good thing, is a good force in the universe. And I think, the finale of Lisztomania is part of that. But in this, he layers in a lot about complicity, I think, and about how, this sort of corrupt approach to art that Wagner is doing leads to a corruption of the soul in general. Like it is a corruption of humanity, what is happening with Wagner, but also like there's little subtle things that are just kind of about it's Nazis and things as a whole. One thing that I noticed, this is sort of a roundabout way to get to this, is that in the background, right before the robot Thor is introduced, there's a bunch of Volkswagen symbols on the wall, like huge Volkswagen symbols. And it made me think this time, I was kind of related to this because this movie is a lot about like legacy and art and art sort of being part of this like corrupting soul corruption, but how some of the legacy of those organizations, those people who benefited from or participated in the Nazism persist today without much in the way of acknowledgement most of the time, Volkswagen being one of them.
Sure. There's a reason my family, when I was a kid, I was like, I want a punch buggy. And my parents were like, we're never buying a Volkswagen.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
In the 80s? Yeah.
And it's a thing that, you know, it comes up. I forget about it often because it just doesn't come up very often. But, you know, there's other things. There's Hugo Boss. There's Coco Chanel. There's...
Yep, some of those fashion motherfuckers.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not just these companies. Some of the individuals still involved hold... It's not just like, well, we never really reckoned with. It's like something that's just still
straight up Nazis. There's
and I mean,
lot of stuff. Yeah. Go ahead.
Look at our country.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking. A friend of my husband, Sean's, actually is in town from Berlin, where she lives now, and we had dinner and we were talking about that. And I was talking to her about how it's kind of funny to me to be thinking about going to Germany to escape fascism, and yet that is, and Germany's got its own fucking problems.
Germany
but like,
does still have its own problems.
Germany's definitely got its own problems, but they're somewhat different problems than the ones we have here. And the Nazi direction we're going here, the specifically Christian nationalism, the white Christian nationalism that is gaining a throttle on so-called politics, which we're having less and less of in this country, is something that is never far from my mind when I was looking at these two films, because they're very instructive as to a lot of the same conditions happening here today. You know, you watch Lisztomania and you hear Wagner's tirades, and it's only, you know, swap out a few specifics.
And
that's the Republican Party today in the United States.
It's 100% that. And I think it's, and there's I mean, one of the, you know, criticisms that I think is sometimes levied against Lisztomania for what it's trying to do. So like, oh, they kind of oversimplify it. And it's like, yes, it's not doing everything. It's not saying, it's not really saying that Wagner invented Nazism.
Oh, it's not really saying that Wagner was the original Hitler who had a gun guitar? Like, what?
You know what I mean? It's like honestly, people are like, well, it's more complicated than that. It's like, no shit, it's more complicated than that. But he had a theme that he was exploring. And like, this is one of the things that makes it a great film, I think, is that it executes focused on its theme. As much as a mess as it looks like it is, it's so focused on its theme of the corruption of art. Like,
exactly.
Even,
and that's...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, just exactly that. I was going to say, it's like you were saying earlier, it's more about the corruption of art, in this case specifically towards fascist ends, but it's more about the corruption of art than it's about the rise of fascism. Yeah. And like, that's what his passion is about that took him to this other place. Like, that's the root of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I actually have a quote about that somewhere here, but we can talk about that in a sec. But one of the things that I think, you know, with that, because that was one of the first things that I hooked onto with the film, was that it was about the corruption of art, and then the corruption of the soul because of corrupted art. Liszt's interactions with heads of state and things like that is a problem.
With Ringo Starr as the Pope, it's a really interesting. I was so struck. This time, I was so struck by the difference in the portrayal of the Catholic Church between the devils and Lisztomania, and how it's so different because it's also the Catholic Church in different places at different times when they're doing different stuff, you know. But like, the church comes off as a bit less horrific in Lisztomania, right? Like, the Catholic Church isn't the big heavy in Lisztomania, right? Like, the Catholic Church doesn't come off as bad as Nazism, but it comes off as corrupting, right? And like, that's in terms of like, it's key to Liszt sells out basically for reasons of his own comfort, even though he doesn't believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
absolutely. It's
and the Pope is portrayed as like less scary than in the Devils, because it's not that people are being tortured and killed in the name of the church, at least not that we're seeing in Lisztomania. But the Pope is just fucking full of himself. He's dressed up, you know, he's played by Ringo Starr in a pointed way. You've got a rock star playing the Pope. He's wearing these outfits that are covered with photos of like old Hollywood movie stars, many of whom haven't even been born yet at the time the events of the film supposedly take place. It's more of that, you know, it's not literal, but it's telling you this is what this guy's about, right? And so he's corrupt. He doesn't give a shit. He's not a true believer. There's a lot of nudge, nudge, wink, wink between him and Liszt. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, etc. And that's a piece of Liszt selling his soul, even though in a way the portrayal of religion is so different from the Devils, but it's and in some ways not as bad, but it's still a piece. It's still doing its part to make things be bad in the broader structure. If anything I just said made any sense.
No, absolutely.
You know, because as we were just talking about it, obviously this is all super resonant to stuff happening in the United States right now, where we also have conditions for emergent fascism, which is happening literally right now, which is cool. One of the things, I'll put a link in the show notes to an article, The Fools of National Socialism by my friend Dan Berger from Abolition Journal. And it's a article he wrote in 2016 about Donald Trump and the role of anti-Semitism in animating Trump's rise, and talking about the role of anti-Semitism in animating far-right power more generally as a kind of far-right ideology. He was talking about how Trump's rise was in part animated by anti-Semitism. I agree that that is true. Jews were also definitely in no way, shape, or form the primary targets of the racism, xenophobia, etc. that Trump campaigned on, right? He said some anti-Semitic stuff, don't get me wrong. He said some anti-Semitic stuff, but it would be ridiculous for me to say that Jews were what he was primarily focusing his rabid, dissatisfied base's anger at. It wasn't primarily being focused on the Jews for a number of reasons, including the fact that US politics vis-a-vis Israel complicate the way a lot of these things manifest, because Trump fucking loves Israel. Because all these motherfuckers love Israel. They love Israel, you know, for reasons of foreign policy efficacy, for reasons of hatred, the other people they hate more than the Jews. They hate the Muslims. Never mind that like Palestinians are not all Muslim at all. There are tons and tons of Christian Palestinians. You would think these people would give a shit about them. They don't. No. Because they don't really care if Palestinians are Christian and Muslim for the purposes of this like clumsy hammer of anti-Semitism, and I'll explain why I'm calling that anti-Semitism in a minute. You know, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's that racialized other who is the scapegoat, who is responsible for all your problems, right? We had a lot of that being Muslims in the 2000s, and Muslims obviously still play that role to a degree in the imaginations of these racists. A lot Christian nationalists tend to see themselves as being in this like, you know, existential struggle with Islam, basically, as the primary religious enemy, as opposed to Judaism. Jews are relegated to a different role right now, in part as everybody's like trying to say like what's good for the Jews versus what's bad for the Jews is just about what's good for Israel and what's not, which is, I would hope listeners of our show understand that Israel is not the Jews. Israel is a nation state. It's a colonial nation state that exists in its current incarnation on a lot of the same kinds of colonialism that we were just talking about vis-a-vis Asgard and Thor Ragnarok. That is there's some commonality there. And Israel's obviously like a key strategic ally for the United States, also for various Christian nationalists, Christian fundamentalists, etc. They're very invested in Israel insofar as how it plays into their understanding of the end days, which they are prepping for, basically.
Yeah.
None of it has anything to do with any kind of love for the Jews. It's just about convenience. It often is very tied actually to hatred for Jews. But point being, so my friend Dan wrote about how the notion that Mexico sends their people, if people remember from early in the Trump campaign, this was one of his first, Mexico's sending their worst people here. That was a big point of his. So Dan points out that Mexico sends their people is a foolish framing of why and how migration happens, yet it reveals the anti-Semitic structure of Trumpian racial logic. Put simply, Trump's anti-Semitism is not primarily about Jews. Rather, the anti-Semitism functions as a structuring apparatus for his racist political outlook. By anti-Semitism, I mean, and this is the pull quote here, I mean a right-wing populist ideological framework that is 1, steeped in conspiracy thinking, 2, premised on a misplaced anti-elitism against a secretive, racialized cabal that, 3, can only be understood in crude patriarchal nationalist terms. And then he goes on to further explain what that means. So you can see examples of an anti-Semitic ideological framework targeting people who are not Jews. For example, today, the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of big thing that pretty angry about this right now, excuse me, the way the right is using transgender people as it's beyond being a wedge issue at this point. Trans people are being scapegoated by the right within a framework where you could really just swap out trans people for the Jews and change a couple things, and it's the same shit. And you'll find with some of them, the ones that are explicit about their own anti-Semitism, you'll start finding some wild stuff about how, like, you know, Jews created transgender people or something like that. And the Jews are somehow, it's basically this big trans Jew conspiracy.
Which actually honestly sounds like a really good party.
The trans Jew conspiracy?
Actually, that's a
just
good
what I want
band
my
name.
life to be.
That's a good band name. We are the trans Jew conspiracy. What's the thing you got to say?
I guess that could have been an
Cleveland. We are the trans Jew conspiracy. Yeah, that's a good band name.
My sister could have called her band that instead of the Shondas. They could have just been the trans Jew consponspacy.
They should do that now.
Well, maybe that'll be our next band. But I thought this was really useful in terms of thinking about these movies, but also in terms of thinking about how these movies relate to not only the past but the present. And I could go off on transphobia for a long time because that's something I'm very preoccupied with and angry about right now. But if you delve into that, actually, it is so fucking just Nazi shit. You've got people with no scientific understanding yelling about, but the science. But science says, they don't fucking know what science says.
Which science? They don't know.
The science. There's 2 genders, which is the same thing as sex, and it's men and women, and it's obvious what it is, and the left is afraid to define a woman.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
Yeah,
I'm afraid to define most things, but it's
a different, but and what's so terrifying right now with the transphobia thing is how people who describe themselves as being liberals or left or feminists or anything like that are eating up some Nazi shit. They're literally eating it up, like this weird logic, this extremely illogical connection in that notorious New York Times article by Paula Paulison or whatever her fucking name is. I can't remember it. That's basically arguing that cis women are losing rights because we are undermining our ability to have quote unquote sex-based rights because of the existence of trans people, basically. The existence of trans women means that abortion gets taken away. Because if you can't even define what a woman is, then how can you give a woman rights or something? Look, I didn't read the fucking article. Honestly.
No, I didn't.
I'm not giving them the
fucking.
I'm not giving them the click.
No, it's yeah, you're right. It is the scapegoating thing, and it is. I mean, and it's and we don't go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Just if I could really quickly say, I'll put this in the show notes too. I was so happy to see this article from Melissa Gira Grant, who literally contextualized this quote unquote feminist fantasy as part of replacement theory, as part of far right replacement theory, a la, as we all remember from Charlottesville, all the chants of Jews will not replace us. They might as well be saying trans women will not replace us. And then you can see, much like with the Jews and anti-Semitism, people who are perhaps a little unstable, things like that, prone to paranoid delusions and things like that. I'm seeing on social media and stuff now, a lot of what are clearly paranoid delusions by cis people vis-a-vis transgendered people that are very, very similar to what delusional anti-Semites will be imagining about, like the Jews being in the walls controlling everything, basically. There's this new thing now you'll see, maybe it's not new, I don't know, where there will be like these cis people who are just convinced that like transgender people are everywhere and you could be one and they could be one. And for some reason, they're very terrified about this. And they seem to feel that not knowing immediately whether somebody is cis or trans is somehow an existential threat to them. And start trying to play like, who's the secret trans person in a very similar way to like, who's the secret Jew? And using basically like fucking like phrenology type shit, like weird racist pseudoscience to be like, well, look at how this person's shoulder is like, because if you really look, you can really tell. And the way they're talking about trans people is exactly the same way, just with some slightly different specifics, although they're both very racialized and racist also, about, how you can tell who a quote unquote real, meaning cis woman is versus a trans woman. And it's almost always focused on trans women as opposed to trans men, although trans men are getting the shit out end of the stick in very high profile ways otherwise, such as apparently you're not able to acknowledge the fact that some trans and non-binary people can become pregnant as well as some cis women.
Yeah.
That's a thing. Apparently you can't acknowledge that because it's erasing women to talk about anybody else's experiences. I'm going on a tangent. I think you had something
it's okay.
to say.
No, what I was going to say about that, and we should probably, like, this is, I think, we're talking about fashion. We're talking about the current rise of fashion in our own country. It's very relevant. I think one of the things, when, and it was something I was thinking about while you're talking a little earlier too, one of the things that is interesting, and what you were pointing out, all these things are just part of a spectrum. Like it's of hate, of other. And what's interesting also to me is some of the misogyny that is baked into even the anti-trans business because of what you were just talking about, is that the fixation is on trans women. Because the thing I think that is shocking for some of these people, fascists in particular, because fascists are so preoccupied with manliness, with masculinity.
It's key to the whole thing.
Because
and traditional gender roles.
Yeah. And I think, this is part of, and this, goes in with, is part of why, one of the things that's important to also acknowledge and talk about as a part of of what's going on with fascism is the incels and things, is it's their obsession with masculinity because of their own perceived impotence or actual impotence, or not literal impotence, maybe literal impotence,
could be,
is their fixation is things must be wrong if men want to be women. But if women want to be men, it's not a problem.
Sure.
Like they don't have as much of a problem with that. Of course you want to be a man. But I think, I think
doesn't mean they'll accept you as a man.
No.
But that doesn't break their brains to imagine that someone would want that. Because they're that.
Well, because they also know how they treat women. Like, why would you want to be a woman? We treat them like shit. I know, which was also borne out in like all those articles that came out like in the middle of the Trump era, where all these like fascist women were like, they treat us so badly. I'm like, well, like nobody has it coming, but you kind of do.
I never thought the cheetahs will eat my face party would eat my face.
Exactly. It's like I don't know. Why would they treat you like that when they treat everybody else like that? Is it because that's how they treat everybody and you're not special? Which is, we're going to see so much more of that is coming up, because the Republicans are, it's without the Scooby Gang, without Mystery Incorporated, we are in like after the final act of a Scooby-Doo episode where the mask is off. It wasn't a very good mask to begin with. And like, I remember I saw something about how like the log cabin Republicans, the gay Republicans had their booth rejected from like a Texas state convention, Republican state convention. It's a couple of years, maybe max, before the black Republicans are told like, yeah, you're not welcome here either. Jewish Republicans, women Republican groups, like they're all going to get kicked to the curb, and they're going to be like, what happened? It's like, well, that's we all told you who they were, so go cry us a river and, maybe learn to be better people.
Someone tells you who they are, believe them. And they've been telling us for a long time. I wanted to ask you, though, before we move on to talking more about iconography specifically, you had mentioned a few times criticisms of the characterizations in Lisztomania. And I know that, because we've talked about it before. Yeah. One of, at least, the things you had in mind was the characterizations of Jews themselves. But I was wondering what else you had in mind, if anything.
I mean, I think that's the main thing, because when I got to that part watching the movie for the first time, I was kind of like, uh-oh.
Tell them about what the part is, what you mean by that.
So it starts at the point where Liszt goes to wherever Wagner is, and it's like a Hammer horror film where he's going up and asking the villagers. The villagers are all Jews, and they're all like this very heightened caricature of like a Hasidic Jewish person. There's lots of Star of David everywhere and other symbols that I don't know the names for, but they're all dressed like that, and they're all also like very sort of comical, they don't really say anything. They sort of chatter and run in sort of sped up film. And then when they're all being murdered by Franken-Wagner Hitler, it's the same thing. And like they, it's that specifically caricature where I was kind of like, well, like this is one where if I tell people to watch this movie, like I'm concerned some people are going to look at that and say like, whoa, wait a second. This is a bad thing. And I'm like, but like everything's sort of a caricature, but it's just a problem. It's just sort of a one where I'm like, cause even when I said like, oh, we're going to go see this movie, you should watch this movie. I was like, it's got some stuff where I can't say it's bad. I see what he's trying to do with it, but I feel like it might make some people uncomfortable.
Look, here's my issue with that scene. My issue with that scene is because even though I feel like I noticed this either when I watched it with you in the theater or maybe I was looking at screen caps later, but my issue is there's people with like prosthetic noses and stuff on in that scene. That's my issue with it. I don't have an issue with the fact that they're portraying observant Jews. I can see why it would definitely see why it would rub someone the wrong way. I don't really care that like, Frankenstein monster zombie Hitler Wagner comes in and just mows them all down and they don't put up like a big resistance fight or something like that. That all tonally and it fits with the film. It doesn't. I can see how people would feel some type of way about it. I can see how it could be upsetting. I can definitely see how it could be upsetting and disturbing. I didn't view the action as scripted as being really anti-Semitic caricature at all. I don't know how it played in the mid-70s, but for me watching it, I have no problem with any of that. The only thing I have a problem with is the Jew face, which is putting prosthetics on people to make them quote unquote look Jewish. That isn't a deal breaker with me for this movie because that is something that happens in movies all the time, and I don't find it I find it offensive here, but I don't find it more offensive here than I do when it's Bradley Cooper playing Leonard Bernstein.
Okay.
For example, which is literally happening right now. They hired Bradley Cooper to play Leonard Bernstein, and they put a fake nose on his fucking face. And it's like, let's not do that.
Yeah.
Let's just not do that. So that bugs me. The rest of it, I don't know. There are a lot of other movies where the Jew face bugs me a lot more here.
Yeah.
Like when it's the lead actor playing a lead role, where I'm not even saying you have to cast Jewish people to play Jewish people. I don't.
But you don't have
that.
to make people up to.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
And especially it's weird with like the nose thing and the Jewish thing. It's anti-Semitic. It
Yeah,
is.
yeah, absolutely.
You know, so let's not. But
Yeah, and it's, for me, it's one of those things where being a white man who is a white cis man who is trying to be sensitive, and I don't always know if something is hitting on a specific, like, whoa, this is actually like a dog whistle that I didn't know about or something like that. So I try to be careful with those things, because there are things where I'm like, there is like genuine, real like value to this film and what it's doing, and even and those scenes also. But also there's something here that could be a problem, but I'm not the person to say it's a problem, basically.
I want to also say that I love the scene where he goes to Vampire Wagner's lair and sees this weirdo performance that he's putting on for all the super children, where there's this literal
monster,
like when this monster representing Jews.
Yeah.
Like big Star of David on his head. He's bald and
the monstrous
like,
teeth and everything.
He looks like an anti-Semitic caricature. He looks like an anti-Semitic cartoon, one of the versions of them. And he pretend rapes like the white Aryan ladies who are naked dancing as part of it. And then, like, I guess Wagner destroys him with music or something is how it resolves.
Yeah, I think so. And
I think that's a great... I mean, I don't think it's great. I think it's anti-Semitic and horrible what's being depicted, but I think that is a very true depiction of this kind of anti-Semitic mythology. And
and
I really appreciated that. I have no problem with that scene. I think that scene's great.
Yeah, I think that's one where I don't think about that one as much in this case, because I'm like, that is like, if you don't get that is a criticism of the propaganda, then you don't get the movie. Like, if you don't get that, you're not paying attention.
Like,
the
and
other
I really
part,
don't
like a little, I need somebody to tell me whether that one's good, right or wrong, or not right or wrong, but like, is there a problem there? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, but I think there's a problem in lots of stuff. I don't think that it's more of a problem than any number of other things. But it's also this thing of like, and seeing some of the reviews we mentioned where people seem to miss the point to a degree. There's also this thing that, especially, maybe it's still like this, I don't know, but like, if you're gonna talk about anti-Semitism or certainly the Holocaust, you can only do it in a very certain way. Like, you have to basically make Schindler's List. Or something of that ilk. And I really don't want to live in a world where we cannot explore these disturbing things through art unless it's like, you know, something people would feel comfortable showing in a shitty high school history class. That's not what art's... I mean, I'm not saying that's not what art's for. Art's for a lot more than just that. Like... And people I see are, there can be a lot of pushback, and some of it I'm sympathetic to a degree. I understand why people are skittish. I understand why people are concerned and all of that. I get that. But especially kind of leading into talking about iconography, actually.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely iconography. And and
the Thor iconography, part of why I think both of these films resonate with me so much is being a Jewish person who, like, the bulk of the largest chunk of my background is Ashkenazi Jewish, right? From all the places that we were and getting kicked out of and shit in Russia and etc. Poland. But then the not Jewish part of my family, the biggest chunk of that is Norwegian.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I'm Jewish and Norwegian. So when I see Nazis who are claiming Norse mythology and things, I mean, we're going to talk about mythology separately, but the way this iconography plays out of, like, the Thor character or something, there is some base level on which I'm like, fuck you, you don't get to have him.
Yeah.
I am more entitled to this dude than you are, basically. And so there is something profoundly healing to me of seeing what Taika Waititi did with the Thor character as a Jewish and Maori director who took this potential symbol of, you know, Aryan manhood and put him in this anti-colonial context where he is reckoning with his own history and choosing how to move forward given that history as a leader. And what he decides to do is destroy his empire home because that's what's necessary to save lives. And also, as a more subtle kind of Jewish theme, like I said before, part of why I was just like, you know, this is a diasporic tale. This is about, like, you know, this is about immigrants, you know, being in new and different places and it not being about having a nation state, which goes back to, you know, big conflict within Judaism right now. Lots of Jews feel, hey, the only reason we haven't been completely wiped out at this point is because we have Israel. And therefore, like, we must, it is our duty to defend Israel. And then there are some of us, like myself, who are like, I can't have my salvation tied to the ethnic cleansing of another group. Yeah. No, you know, or, you know, et cetera. So these are some of the reasons why Thor Ragnarok resonates, and to a degree Lisztomania too, because there's some of this stuff bubbling around in there, but especially Ragnarok really, like, is right here for me.
One of the things you're saying made me think of that for Thor really, in Ragnarok, you know, he doesn't just destroy Asgard and then sort of destroy the empire. He destroys what is his empire. Ultimately, Odin is dead. This usurper Hela is trying to take it over and sort of reinforce it as an empire. And so he decides that it's not just about destroying the place of Asgard. It is about changing Asgard and saying that, you know, I'm destroying this place, but also this empire. We are not an empire. And as you say, they become the wandering group.
Right. And obviously Jews didn't have an empire that was, you know, I just, you know,
not
the analogy only goes so far, but continue.
But it's but in terms of the confrontation with imperialism, like, the end of the movie is the hero destroys the empire in a very, his empire specifically. You know, it's not just like, I'm destroying the other evil empire. I'm looking at this and saying, like, this fucked, and I'm gonna destroy what is mine. And, you know, there's maybe something in there to say that the only way to really destroy those is for somebody to somebody who is the inheritor of it to be the one to say that we can't have this anymore. There's an argument that maybe almost, that's what it's saying, but I don't know.
It reminds me of, you know, Race Trader, the journal edited by Noel Ignatov, who died
I don't think so, but anyway.
Years ago. Okay. Well, the slogan of Race Trader was treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. And the theory was part of what needs to happen to dismantle white supremacy is for white people to basically stop being white, to stop identify as being white, because whiteness only exists as an oppressive racial class, which at least if we're talking about the United States of America and the history of race here, fucking fight me. That is just true. Yeah. That is just true. It doesn't, it doesn't exist otherwise. How and where to do that is a little thorny, because I don't necessarily think it's super useful for white people to just be like, but I'm not white because I'm rejecting my whiteness. That has its own own problems. But there is something radical and true, I believe, about that concept. And I kind of feel when I watch Thor Ragnarok, like you're kind of seeing a dramatization of that concept to a degree. It's not explicitly and specifically about whiteness, but it is about being a part of something that is core to your identity, that you come to realize that thing needs to be destroyed in order for you to be able to move forward as a decent person.
Yeah.
And to not continue to harm others. Like whiteness doesn't exist without racism.
Right.
Asgard doesn't exist without imperialism. That's part of the lesson of Ragnarok is Odin tried to be like, hey, we're a kinder, gentler empire now.
Yeah.
But that can only be sustained so long. Because the past isn't going to stay buried.
No,
and people don't like being oppressed, nor do elves, I would guess.
Yeah. And I think there's probably something interesting about how this film recontextualizes the previous film. So as we were talking about iconography, I mean, the obvious like point or the connection point on these two films in iconography is Thor, although and that Wagner builds a Thor, even though. And I think there's probably something that Ken Russell was saying when he explicitly says, oh, he's like out of a comic book, is that he was probably criticizing the superhero character Thor. Like he was incorporating that, like here is, for what it was at the time, which is, not too dissimilar from what he is in the movies now. He was a little less silly, but in terms of like characterization. But I think, he may have had an argument that like, well, it's persisting this thread of, the primacy of, or not primacy, but the interest in Norse mythology being related to that, because, Wagner builds this thing, this Thor, which is explicitly supposed to be, explicitly
but he fails. He's like trying to train the Thor, because he's like Goldstein, Silverstein, like kill, trying to give him the like. And all he wants is a beer Stein. A Stein, and then he wakes up and he's like Stein, and Wagner's like, yes, kill the Stein. He grabs a beer, which also reminded me of Thor, because there's a funny scene in Thor Ragnarok where he's drinking a Stein of beer with Doctor Strange,
and it keeps refilling. But it's. I mean, I think we've got that connection. I think part of what he was doing, what Russell was doing, was he's like, okay, well, Wagner didn't really like do Thor, but he had Siegfried, and there's a thread there, there's a line there between them
in the ring cycle, which I'm not super familiar with, but
I'm not particularly. I've read about it. I've read about what the storyline is, and it's about. And actually, this is relevant to both of these films. So the ring cycle broadly follows, or at least part of it follows the relationship between Siegfried, this hero, and a Valkyrie named Brunhilde. The character that Tessa Thompson plays, and this is something that we can talk about and recontextualize. Valkyrie is based on a comic book character, roughly but loosely based on a comic book character, which they then separated after the movie came out, called Brunhilde, who's based on the ring cycle character. And I think that there's probably a thread that Ken Russell is saying. It's like, okay, well, Wagner put this into popular imagination, and so that's why we have this, and these are all connected, and then we have Thor in Ragnarok, so we've got those close connections there.
Not to interrupt, but one of the things about not only Ragnarok, but the Thor series in general that made a lot of Nazis mad was about the casting of some of the characters, and specifically casting Black actors.
Yeah, they really did not like that.
Also, like, let's just make a point that Thor in the MCU is a space Viking from another planet. He's got nothing to do with, like, Vikings from Norway.
No. Other than some inspiration,
which is part of why I'm like, this is part of my heritage. But like,
The thing that's interesting is something, and we're kind of getting into these all inform each other what we're talking about. But like, what's interesting, and I would have to dig up the thing I was reading before, is there's scholarship about Norse mythology. Norse mythology is one of the European mythologies that we actually do not have a lot of documentation of, because when they converted to Christianity, they destroyed a lot of things. And they also, a lot of this took place when there wasn't a lot of written language. It's also one of the few of these mythologies that actually persisted as an actual form of worship until the 20th century. It's an interest, like, I don't mean just like Nazis. I mean, like, there were parts of, the Scandinavian region where small villages like that was still part of their religion, religious practices. But we do not have a lot of information about them, and scholarship is fairly limited on it. We only have 2 written sources: the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, I think are what they're called. But there is some scholarly theorizing that Norse mythology has its origins in Asia. And closer to India. There are some threads and connections going back to some religions over there. And, like most mythologies, some academics try to look at it and say, like, okay, there's a story here that is maybe about history, the history. And there's a lot of little clues here about how it may be from further east, east. It may be from further east into Asia, into Southeast Asia, where the origins of Norse mythology come from. It also, and there's other fun stuff. Like there's a theory that actually Loki and Odin were originally the same character, that were divided over the years into separate things. It's also interesting to a degree that there's a fascist, they're usually not, smart about context and history, but that there's a Nazi interest in this, for how flexible some of Norse mythology is when it comes to things like gender roles. Loki himself being a very good example of that. We see in the movies, in Thor, we actually see three of Loki's children from the mythology, not his children in the movies. There is Hela. There is Fenrir, her pet wolf is actually her brother. And then there's also Sleipnir, who is we only see in the first Thor movie, Odin's horse with the 8 legs, which Loki is not Sleipnir's father, but actually Sleipnir's mother, because Loki is gender fluid.
And they barely fucking get into that in any of the Marvel stuff, but they do start to touch on it or hint at it. They play with it, which sadly are crumbs enough for us, harkening back to some of what we were complaining about earlier about Marvel and Disney, and how they'll only go so far into giving you some edgy queerness in their films. And it has to be something that can be easily cut out without messing up the rest of the plot, so they won't ever be that much of a part of the plot, which is part of why, honestly, fuck Disney.
Yeah.
Like, just fuck Disney. But I mean, it's also, that's part of, I love the Loki character, and I like Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of the Marvel Loki. That's, part of what got me to this movie in the first place, because like back in the Avengers movies and stuff, which I have not rewatched because they're not that good. I always really liked him and was like, I'll follow this guy. Yeah. Like, I want to see what this guy's doing in whatever. So
yeah, no, I agree. And I think one of the things that they have done well with that character, and it plays out actually very well in Ragnarok, is that Loki is a trickster character, in the very traditional mythological sense, in which he is gender fluid. He is, he's a shapeshifter. He's also fluid in terms of his, alignments as far as concepts of good and evil. It's, and in many ways, like, he is Bugs Bunny, because Bugs Bunny is the same character who is also gender fluid. And, these trickster characters are something that I think are core to a lot of mythology for a good reason, not just for being sort of a semi-antagonist or, you know, sometimes they're the clown, whatever it is, but they are very important, I think, because they are lost in some ways in some of our modern society, because the only like good example I can think of that's modern and not pulled from something else is Bugs Bunny. Is they teach about gray areas. They teach about that things are not A or B in certain respects. Like when that becomes a core of your cultural identity, is that we have a god or we have a character that is core here that is not one or the other. That I think that can allow cultures and can allow people to understand better gray areas, or when things don't fit in a box. And I'm just making this shit up off the top of my head right now. That wasn't a point I wanted to make at one point, but now I'm like tricksters and I want to talk about Bugs Bunny.
So another example, I don't think you ever got, I don't know if you ever watched this at all, and if you did, I don't think you got far enough, but Netflix's Shiro, the Double Trouble character, is another gender fluid trickster.
Okay.
Who a lot of the stuff you're talking about definitely applies as well.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, and just to kind of get in, you know, the iconography and the art and mythology and culture stuff is all throughout both of these is, I mean, I think when we talked about, and I hope you don't mind if I kind of move on to this point about transforming it, is one of the things that I find really interesting about, like, you know, first about Lisztomania, you know, is really what we already talked about, is this Russell is concerned with art. And I'm going to read this relatively long quote. It's kind of before a bit about transforming art and myth, from this article from Film Comment from 1975 called Russellmania by Stephen Farber. And I got a couple quotes from this, but I want to read this one first. The sense of horror and outrage in this section of the film, which he's referring to the end of the film, does not come from Russell's feeling about Hitler. His concern about the abuses of art gives the film its passion. Russell wants to see the connections between Liszt and Wagner, not just the family connection or the musical influence of one on the other, but the influence of Liszt's flamboyant commercialism on Wagner's megalomania. The cult of the superstar, which is what we were talking about a bit ago with Marilyn Manson, led to the more sinister cult of the Superman. Liszt's screaming fans are the same girls who stand respectfully in front of Wagner's tomb. Russell's point is not simply that hysterical teenagers are incipient fascists. What he is really saying in Lisztomania is that once the artist surrenders to the rule of the marketplace, he has violated the natural order of the universe and released demons that cannot be controlled. There's more from this article about the truth of the connections between Liszt and Wagner and Hitler and the rise of Nazism. And then there's this piece. The Nazi scenes are not meant to be taken literally. They express Russell's worst fears of what can happen when art is perverted by show business and political fanaticism. The paranoia in this view of the artist's responsibility is bizarre, but there is something irresistibly romantic in Russell's concern for the artist's integrity. In a world where everything has been debased and devalued, Russell still envisions art as the central creative act that brings order to a chaotic universe. The fact that most of his films examine the artist's betrayal of his vocation cannot obscure Russell's belief in the moral importance of art. His exalted view of art seems slightly insane and rather breathtaking. And this reminds me of a thing I've told you about, and I don't think you've watched this one yet, but Russell's other biopic on Mahler.
No, I know it's on Criterion, and I will, because I also am no classical music buff, but I like Mahler to the degree if I'm like gonna pick a composer, I enjoy some Mahler. I have intentionally gone to, you know, see Mahler's music perform. So I'm certainly very interested in Ken Russell's biopic of Mahler, and I know it has some shared themes with this one, and some obvious
and characters as well. Wagner appears, and there is a sequence that is about Mahler essentially giving up his Judaism. That is sort of hints of what of this sort of approach that he'll take in Lisztomania. She is basically dressed like a dominatrix with a big swastika on her leather ass, and he's being forced to like eat pork and do some other things, and in this sort of representational, this fantastical approach to depicting that. And it's a criticism that, and I don't even think it's necessarily Russell saying like, oh well, you gave up your Judaism and that is how you betrayed yourself. I think it's that is a representation of giving up his artistic integrity. And much like the castration scene.
I was about to say, just like the penis guillotine.
The penis guillotine, like it's all
penis
like,
guillotine, eating pork.
And I think the transformational nature of art and mythology and culture, like in how they can transform things, is a big part of Lisztomania, but also how they are transformed, you know, and what we were just talking about Wagner. And he's taking Norse mythology and through his ring cycle, which loosely interfaces with Norse mythology. Odin is a character in it, although I think they use Woden or Wotan, one of the other names for him. And then, you know, there's the Valkyrie, Brunhilde, and the hero Siegfried, and these are, you know, his way of transforming that. And then it's being used because it's this corruption.
Well, he's weaponizing it. He's weaponizing Norse mythology through his corrupted art, right? He's like turning, you know, this into a weapon of anti-Semitism, even though it's like Odin and Thor and all these characters don't have anything to do with hating Jews.
No,
they've got nothing to do with that. But being like, hey, we're going to reclaim, you know, this Aryan history that we've decided we have rights to, and hold it up in opposition to, you know, the Jews who have been decided to be the other.
And the thing that, oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I want to keep talking about this. I just wanted to bring Ragnarok into the discussion of the role of art in molding culture, maintaining, etc. Word salad coming out of my mouth. But I wanted to talk about music specifically and art more generally in Ragnarok as well, which it is not nearly the focus in the way it is in Lisztomania, because like you said, Lisztomania is primarily concerned with questions of art and artists, and the fascism and all that is just a vehicle for exploring, you know, the power of art for good or evil and all that. But I noted because I watched these two this week, and I watched them back to back. I watched Lisztomania and then I watched Ragnarok right afterwards. And that was a great way to watch them, because it made all of the parallels all the more obvious. And one of the things that I hadn't really ever thought about with Ragnarok before is like, one, these are both movies that use like synthesizer music in it's anachronistic in Lisztomania. It's not in Ragnarok, but it's surprising. Like the very score of Thor Ragnarok has all this synth in it that's like super awesome, but it doesn't sound like other superhero movie scores. No. I mean, this is part of why I love this movie, because it's just on every level. Everyone was bringing their A game, you know, like not just the script, not just the acting, the characters, the story. It's the sound, you know, the score, the sound design, the art direction, the costumes, the makeup, everything was just like, and the score was great like that. But also the thing I hadn't paid as much attention to is how the Grand Master is always like, when he's giving Thor his like rundown of here's the deal on Sakaar and here's why I'm so great and this is how things are going to be. Fuck you, you're stuck. He's like playing his little synthesizer the whole time. He's making this little like synth accompaniment to his horrific spiel. And like there's ways in which, and that comes up like they escape on the party ship that has like music that plays as well as fireworks and other things. But there's a lot with Jeff Goldblum noodling around on a synthesizer in Thor Ragnarok and doing it as part of his, what I'm going to call kind of Wizard of Oz act. And that reminded me a little bit of when Wagner turns a guitar into a gun at the end of Lisztomania. It's not as smacking you the face about it. It's not as much of the main point, but it's a thing that's kind of happening in the background of kind of the weaponizing of music and art more broadly. The other very obvious thing to point to is the scene we already talked about where Hela points to the paintings, you know, and how like these paintings, someone painted a myth. And those paintings of the myths, when they are physically destroyed in the film, that, you know, corresponds to the breaking of the myth's power over the people and the empire. Like when she destroys the painting, she destroys the myth, right?
Yeah. And I think, you know, and both of these are very much like dealing with that like cultural mythology of like who we are. Like that Wagner's building one. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to build his conception of this, or a conception of it. You know, in the movie, it's his conception of it. He was part of something larger in reality.
Right. And it corresponds in Ragnarok to the changing of what Asgard is. Asgard was an empire. The empire is destroyed. Asgard is now a bunch of refugees. Yeah.
And so, you know, they're different ends of it, but it's the same, you know, there's the art to it. There's the construction or deconstruction of these cultural mythologies. I mean, and one of the things that I think when we initially talked about doing this, one of the things that I definitely wanted to talk about and was curious about, interested in, was the fact that, you know, Lisztomania is we have Wagner, he takes Norse mythology, he uses it in sort of this creation of Nazism, and this anti-Semitism, and then Lisztomania is sourced in a different repurposing of those mythological depictions and all of that, in that, you know, the comic book form was created by the artist and the writer Stanley Jack Kirby, Jewish men.
Ragnarok. I think you said Lisztomania, but
sorry. Thor.
No,
Thor
no
the comics. Thor the comics. Like it was, you know, the source for Ragnarok. Jewish men taking this concept,
and a little bit of a Korean dude, right? And then when we get into the story for Ragnarok. Right.
Well, Ragnarok, the movie, is directed by a Jewish Maori man. And part of the story, it's based very loosely, very, very loosely on the Planet Hulk storyline, which was from the early 2000s, which was written by Greg Pak, who's a Korean American person. That didn't involve Thor at all. But like the basis for Ragnarok is really coming from a multicultural sort of repurposing of certain iconography, repurposing of certain mythological figures and concepts. As I said before, the Valkyrie character in Ragnarok, very loosely based on the Valkyrie character from the comics, who is Brunhild, who is inspired by the character from the Ring Cycle, who is said to be, within the context of the comic books, the inspiration for that. They took it and they said, we're going to have a woman of color play this character. Now she became a different character in the books, and they're separate so that they could have both. But regardless, like they said, okay, we're going to do this. And we're going to make it for more people. We're going to say, like, this is not about your cultural mythology and your cultural conception, which is honestly, as I said, like probably ahistorical. I think it's I think, you know, not only do they believe that Norse mythology is sourced from further east, but also that Aryans themselves, the entire concept of Aryans, are actually Indian. I think that there's a recontextualization. There is taking this, there is transforming it, and that these things are transformed, and that this art is both something that we transform and that can be transformational and can be positive or negative. I think that ultimately Russell is saying that it has a great positive transformational possibilities in the finale of the film with the rainbow lasers of love. And then I think that there is something positive about Thor Ragnarok in general, for the way that even in this mainstream film, doesn't push it too far, but it's there, is confronting the concept of imperialism. And we're definitely talking about America or any other country, but for us, Ragnarok is about America and destroying the cultural mythology of what we are, which is something that is ongoing right now. And I think it feeds that. And it feeds a thought process for people behind that. It may not be, a great revelation for everybody or some people who see it, but I think it contributes.
Yeah, and it's also about New Zealand and Australia, right? Yeah. And there are some pretty relevant things that we didn't talk about some of this stuff as much. We'll put a bunch of articles
there's a
lot of articles where people talk. Yeah, and specifically I wanted to talk about some of the stuff that I haven't seen as much written about already, and so I'm just going to briefly touch on the fact that many people have commented about how much Maori and some other indigenous colors, symbols, imagery, language is woven into Thor Ragnarok, especially on Sakaar. There's been a lot written about that, so I don't want to spend too much time going into it because I think a lot of people have very well covered this and talked about it. But a lot of the ships specifically, the ship they escape on, the Grandmaster's party ship that they go back to Asgard on, is the colors of the Australian Aboriginal flag. Valkyrie's ship is the colors of the Maori flag. There's a lot of symbolism going on in there. And I think I've talked a bit about Taika Waititi being Jewish and the relevance of that to this material. Obviously, the fact that he's Maori, coming from people who have, had their lands colonized and been oppressed under colonization in New Zealand and Australia, that's super relevant to all of this as well. And I think his location having that as a part of his history, as well as some of the stuff that we've talked about, what the history of Jewish people has been over the past couple hundred years, that's a good position to be coming to the material in the Ragnarok script from, which he didn't write that script.
No, but he's definitely coming to it from me, yeah.
And he brought a lot. He built out, I think, a lot of the meaning of the movie through some of these visuals and things like that. God, I had a fucking point I wanted to make, and now I'm spacing on
well, I mean, he's taking his own, these colors and these ideas, and he's introducing them and expanding on these concepts, expanding on sort of or weaving in, I guess, more different cultural relevance to say something broadly. So
yeah, and another thing that I wanted to briefly touch on that I think is related to why this movie is so good is it's one of very few Marvel movies that does not have any U.S. military personnel or weapons or anything like that in it at all, because I guess there's
technically Scourge has machine guns.
He has machine guns, but they're not U.S. military machine guns, because this is one of the very few. No, because this is one of the very few Marvel movies that was not made in cooperation with the military. There was no, because they're like, hey, you can use this stuff, but we also get approval over your scripts, right? And I don't know if this is true, but I did read that that's also part of why Waititi was able to put a lot of improvisation in this movie and kind of tweak a lot of things, because normally there's tighter control over the scripts when these things go to shoot, because the military needs to fucking approve anything. So people are really, anytime there's a change, that could create an issue down the line, because we definitely need to have this military partnership to make these superhero movies. And this one didn't have that. And it's not that it didn't have it because the military was like, this is too radical for us or something like that. It just was never on the table because it doesn't need to be, right? Yeah. Because it doesn't need to be. But that also is part of why it was able to be as good as it is, I think, because most of the other ones, you just don't have that kind of creative freedom. Because it's baked in. You're doing a Marvel movie? Well, guess what? It's in partnership with the Army, like fucking Captain America Civil War is the greatest movie ever, join the army. Basically, is all to harken back to our Josie and the Pussycats episode. Because these movies are, and we haven't talked about this much, and a lot of ink spilled on this already. We don't need to talk about it much, but one of the issues with Marvel movies is that they are military propaganda. That's not my analysis. That's just a fact. They are done in conjunction with the military, and the military gets input into how they are portrayed, which is part of why you'll notice, like, portrayed pretty well. That limits what these films can do. Just like writing them and shooting them in a way so that you can cut all of the gay content out and not lose out on any of that sweet, sweet international market money.
Right.
That compromises what these films can be. It limits them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is the rare example where, because of some loosened limitations as well as whatever like perfect storm of stuff, they were able to do a lot with this one. But I don't anticipate seeing that many more examples of that. Like there aren't. Black Panther also does a lot of interesting stuff that has some problematic stuff in terms of the role of the CIA in it. That's a little bit more traditional Marvel in my issues with it. But that also has a lot of genuinely cool opening things up politically a bit stuff in it. I don't have the highest expectations for Black Panther 2 Wakanda Forever, nor do I have the highest expectations for Thor Love and Thunder, though I will totally see both movies.
Yeah.
But this was a special one, and I'm sure we could talk about it.
We could, but
all
we could talk
day.
for a while.
We talked for a long time. We talked for a long time, guys. Join our Patreon if you want to see the whole episode.
The whole episode.
The whole shebang.
I think we've said many things. I think we could both probably talk about both of these movies for a lot longer, but
we could. We can save that for the mini episodes where we'll be like, oh, and I forgot this, and I forgot this, because there's going to be a million of those. Because we've got stuff to say about these movies. But let us know what you think about these movies. You know, let us know why we're right. Let us know why we're wrong. Let us know what we didn't think of. And let us know what you thought of us.
And we'll talk about stuff in a mini episode with whatever you guys have to say about it.
Let us know.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us as always. And now go away.
Go
Bye.
away. All right. Celluloid Mirror is a 4 Mile Circus production hosted by Nicole Solomon and Sean Mannion. Our theme music is Twisted by Kevin MacLeod. You can hear more from Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.filmmusic.io. Please take a few moments to rate and review the Celluloid Mirror on your podcast platform of choice. It really helps with discoverability. If you have questions or comments about what you heard on the show or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to email us at info@4milecircus.com or seek us out on social media. We are at 4 Mile Circus on Twitter and Instagram. Want more from the Celluloid Mirror? Sean and Nicole join our Patreon at patreon.com/4milecircus. You'll get early access to episodes, uncut video of our recording sessions, access to our Discord server, and much more. To learn more about everything we do, visit us at 4milecircus.com.
I ended up in that hall of mirrors. There was another girl. She looked like me. Exactly like me.
Can you come with me in my dreams?
That'll do, Pig.
What happens when the story dies? The evil is set free.
to return some videotapes.